I think the text actually shows that Joseph Smith was not following a rigid outline in front of him during dictation, but that he wanted to have that out of the way so that he could just let the Spirit inspire him to go wherever the Spirit led him, even if it was new information that he hadn't thought of before. And we've got Joseph Smith doing this. So we know that Joseph Smith knows the difference between this introductory head portion and this later portion.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. I'm very excited for today's episode. I will be interviewing scholar and author of the book Visions in a Seer Stone, Joe Smith and the Making of the Book of Mormon, William Davis. William, thank you for joining me today.
All right, it's good to be here.
Yeah. I think we're in contact probably around a year or so ago. You're one of the people I've read your book, and I really liked your theory for how Joseph Smith either naturally could have composed the Book of Mormon or also how you could incorporate that into your view of the translation. I've done my own sort of series on the Book of Mormon, and I've spoken to a variety of different people, mainly sort of like faithful scholars or apologists, people like Dan Peterson or Stephen Smoot, Blake Ostler, Brent Gardner, Brian Hales. I've also spoken with Dan Vogel and his theory for how Joseph created the Book of Mormon. And you're somebody I really was looking forward to doing the interview with, so I'm really excited for this opportunity to talk about your book, Visions in the Seer Stone. I read it on PDF form, but I can see it there behind. So maybe you could grab your book and show it to people. I know you also have a slide about it as well. But in this interview, we're going to be talking about your book and your theory for how Joseph Smith orally dictated the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the book, Visions in a Seer Stone, published in 2020 by the University of North Carolina Press. And
Quite recent.
yeah, so well, it's recent, but it seems like in the modern world where something comes up, you instead of 15 minutes of fame, it's more like 30 seconds of TikTok fame, and then you're forgotten.
Right.
So it's interesting. It's been fun to write, but there's so many other good books and stuff coming through all the time. You never know, or are people still thinking about this or not? So I appreciate you bringing me on so we could chat about it.
Yeah, no, and I've really enjoyed reading through your book. I thought it was a really interesting theory. It's one that's gotten a lot of attention from faithful scholars or apologists as well, trying to respond to some of the things in it. And whenever I did my sort of final episode on the Book of Mormon, and I was sort of coming up with my own sort of naturalistic explanation, although I'm a believer, I kind of wanted to steelman the naturalistic explanation. And I incorporated a lot of things from things in your book, but we talked about off air that people could view your theory for Book of Mormon composition. It could fit with the naturalistic theory of Joe Smith being the author and him just orally creating this from his own environment and from the sermon culture. But you could also incorporate some of this into it being a translation, and it wouldn't have to undermine people's belief in the divinity or even the historicity of the Book of Mormon. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's one thing I appreciate about your book, is that you're not trying to disprove the Book of Mormon or to undermine or hurt anybody's faith. And I think that's a good thing. So it can cause people to almost like put down their swords and be a little bit more open and not take it as a threat, and maybe try to understand more of what you're trying to say. I guess my question is, was that an important part of your motivation for writing the book?
Yeah, that was a big part of when I was finally putting it together, because I'm thinking about the audience who's going to be reading this. And while I was writing something that was technically an academic book that was aimed at introducing ideas into the academic world, not just about Mormon studies, but also about some sermon culture in the past, the role of orality in the early 19th century. But knowing that some of this stuff could be potentially threatening if people didn't have a way to contextualize it within a paradigm of faith. And so what I did in the book is I went out of my way to say, look, if you're a believer, here are some ways to look at this information so that in a way that doesn't hurt your faith, it can actually help make sense out of things where there have been questions in the past where people have wondered, how exactly does this work? Even if I believe the Book of Mormon is true, there's still some outstanding questions.
Right.
And and so what's been fun for me is I've got lots of different responses. What's really been satisfying because I really did work. I put stuff in there where even during the publication process, some of the people who were involved said, this is an academic work. All this stuff you're writing towards believers and how that they can view it, that's really, mm,
It
this is
almost seems
more.
apologetic here, devotional.
Yeah, it seems like going too far at trying to make an effort to help believers kind of see this. And I said, but that's really important to me because people will read this, and if they don't have that, then they might just perceive it as, just another attack on the Book of Mormon and then dismiss it. But my point is, I want people, so I'm trying to get people to just, like you say, put down the swords, step back, and just look at the evidence
Hmm.
and then say, well, how, because there are things here that I am absolutely certain were involved in the translation process, and we have evidence for it, lots of evidence. And if we just kind of relax and then realize this might mean we have to change some of our opinions, and I say opinions, I'm not talking about doctrine. I'm not talking about,
Yeah, maybe some of our
your
views
Vulcans.
or assumptions about like the nature of the translation or Joseph's
Yeah.
involvement or yeah, the words in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, because a lot of that, and I'll go into this, but a lot of how we understand things, there's a mixture of at core, there's a doctrine, but then as you go out and people try to explain how it all happened, you move away from doctrine into just different people's ideas or theories about how it could have happened. And then so I'll go into that
We'll,
just a
we'll get
little
into that.
deeper.
But before we talk about your book and look at the slides, maybe for any people who aren't aware of who you are or aware of the book, maybe in a couple of minutes you could just talk a little about like your background, sort of like your biography. I believe you grew up in the church, so a little about maybe your relationship with the church, your scholarship, because I have here you have a PhD in theater and performance studies, so maybe touch on that, and then how that led you to writing the book.
Okay. So yeah, I grew up in Provo, Utah, you know,
Oh well.
in the and at one time I lived even practically in the shadow of BYU Stadium.
You're
Cougar
right in the
football
bubble.
was,
My
oh
goodness.
yeah.
Wow. I went to the Provo MTC, so that's my only experience with Provo.
Okay. And so I grew up, uh, did everything that you do in, the church and participation and going on a mission.
Where'd you serve?
It was the New Zealand Auckland mission,
Oh,
but
that's not a mission. That's a holiday.
well,
Beautiful scenery there.
but what was really nice about it is the majority of my time wasn't actually in New Zealand, but I was up in the Cook Islands, in the South Pacific. And so, yeah, and what it was really beautiful. Um, the people were amazing, um, but the mission was hard
Yeah.
because people are very much entrenched in their traditions, and so trying to find converts was really, really, really tough.
What's the main
And
religion in New Zealand?
oh, in New Zealand,
Or are they
I don't know.
religious in that sense, or is it more
Yeah,
like yeah?
yeah, yeah. There are all kinds of religions, and in the Cook Islands, it was the CICC, Cook Island Christian Church, and it was a Protestant denomination. And then there were little representations. There were a few Catholics over here. There were two or three Baha'i over there. There was a small handful of Jehovah's Witnesses, but primarily it was the Cook Island Christian Church. And then back in New Zealand, it was just a hodgepodge of everybody that was there. And I was on the North Island. A lot of time was in Auckland. And then I spent some time at a town right in the middle of the North Island called Taupo. and there's a great big lake there, and lots of people would love. Even now, they go there to fish for these huge trout that are all over the place. And yeah, I spent most of my time though there in Auckland, and when because I learned Cook Island Maori, most of my mission was among the Pacific Islanders. So the Tongans, Samoans, um, Cook Islanders, Tokaloans, you know,
That's
and
awesome.
then that's kind of, and it was fantastic um, working with people because they're just so lovely, so wonderful. But yeah, so that was my background. Then after that, after I got home, um, and this would be turned into a long, complex personal narrative that is half pushback in my past anyway. But there were things that happened, things that I was experiencing, things that I was witnessing, and where finally I just drifted away from the church.
Hmm.
Um, and so I've probably about half my lifetime's been active and maybe a third of it semi-active, and then it was just easier at one point just to step back and step away. Still a member of the church technically. I mean, um, but I don't participate anymore. The
Yeah.
reason why though I would come around and start working in Mormon studies again um, is because during the course of my own faith journey, you might say, I there was a point in my life where for myself I really had to get some answers to a few questions I had. And so I started off on my own kind of pathway of study.
Mm.
And it was kind of interesting in one sense because um you grow up in the church and you say, you should read only approved materials. And so that's all I did is read approved materials. And then anytime I started to come across something that kind of felt like might be an attack, I would just shut that out um, because I didn't feel secure enough in church history to know when something that was said might be the actual truth or if somebody was trying to twist it a little bit. And I thought if all
Right.
these people are attacking the church, I could never ever trust any material that was written by someone who I perceived to be as anti-Mormon or attacking the faith.
Mm.
So those materials were off the table. And so what I was doing is I was kind of going through the proper books, the proper channels, but instead of just trusting what they said, I said, I want to go back to the sources myself and I want to explore because there's got to be more here um, and see for myself. And that's actually where um, more and more questions and things started to come up and I did my own state. And it was funny though, because at one point I reached out to someone and I said, I'm really having trouble. I've got this question, I've got that question. And I'm just not making sense of it. And the person responded to me saying, "Oh, you sound like you're kind of in the Dan Vogel camp on this question or that question or the other." And and I was embarrassed. I wrote back because I said, who's Dan Vogel?
And
And so
how
what
how
they're
long ago was this? Was this after you sort of stopped attending church?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And so, I know sometimes when people say, "Oh, you've been out reading the anti-Mormon literature, and then this is what's caused you to kind of have your shaken
Produce these
faith or whatever."
views.
I wasn't reading any of that, and so I did not know who Dan Vogel was, for example, and then I thought, maybe I should kind of expand and start reading everybody, and then, but just kind of come up to my own determination. But anyway, so there was a really long process there of a lot of just my own independent going after things. And
Right.
then,
I think a lot of people either believers in the Book of Mormon who are quite interested in scholarship, or people who leave the faith. The Book of Mormon is one of those things where it's like almost like a puzzle, and people are trying to piece together, how do we have the Book of Mormon? How was it created? Whether or not naturalistically, or if you believe it's ancient, it's quite fascinating for people to try to figure out the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, and so for me, what kind of happened is, so in my own life, I wasn't even looking at Mormon studies, and certainly not Mormon history, because I haven't really said this out loud before to people, but Mormon history sometimes is, oh my gosh, to me, it's really boring, and I didn't
I felt
want
like
to.
that as a seminary student. I didn't find church history that interesting until I was exposed to maybe some of the
Yeah,
more controversial things, and then that I found that more interesting. Um, but yeah, I'm totally with you there. So after you
yeah.
stopped going to church for the first, like, say, what, 10, 15 years out of the
Hmm.
church, you weren't really even looking that heavily into Mormon studies or Mormon history
No, I was at
or
my big
critical
focus.
information.
No, my big thing was Shakespeare, and I had kind of I I got my undergraduate. I was in an actor training program, and then I also got an undergraduate degree in film. And then I went on to a master's program. I started out the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. It's one of it just disbanded because of economic problems this last year. It was kind of shocking. But anyway, it was one of the better known actor training programs in the country. When I was there, before I finished, I was invited to be part of another master's training actor training program in classical text with Shakespeare and people in the time period. So I went over to Washington, D.C. It was part of the Shakespeare Theater in Washington, D.C. And so I would got my master's there. And then that's actually when I started getting really interested in the scholarship of Shakespeare, because it turns out that Shakespeare used complex chiasmus all over the place in his compositions. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. Maybe I could write about it. And so then I started to shift away from like the performance side over into the scholarly side. And
Kind of
so
like
that was a
theoretical
big,
side, right?
and so really in the course of doing all of this scholarship and working with the text, that's when I started to, well, I was really fascinated in the text. I was fascinated in source criticism. I was fascinated in rhetorical analysis. So looking at a text and seeing all the different ways that Shakespeare was using classical rhetorical figures to do these flourishing words and amazing insights. And in that process, I had also stumbled across things that actually related back to Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. So I eventually found enough information. I thought, maybe I should kind of pick this up. And so it was really because I had been raised Mormon, and so much of my worldview and life experience had been shaped by or informed by Mormonism. So even though someone might drift away, there's still a large part of who they are culturally, at
Right.
least, and even their identity that's still very much a product of that environment. And
Sure.
so for me, it was kind of like exploring my own origins, the way my own worldview, my outlook on life, and the Book of Mormon was kind of at the core of that, because the way you're taught, the things you learn, the basis for a lot of that ultimately comes from, we believe this teaching because the Book of Mormon is true and Joseph was a prophet, or we believe that teaching because, so, and I thought, so this is really formative to my own identity.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, so I just started peeling back the layers to see, I want to see what's in here. I want to see what's down there. And I want to start using all of these skills in textual analysis that I've been developing, and then maybe look back and see what that might inform me about myself.
Fascinating. So we're going to be
Yeah.
talking about, you've got slides prepared in your book. I really appreciate you talking about your background in scholarship, and actually that was new to me, learning like what caused you to want to write the book. And so basically what we're going to be talking about in this interview is William Davis's his sort of theory for how the Book of Mormon was dictated and created, looking at sort of like this laying down heads theory, which if I were to summarize, we're going to talk about this, but in like a minute. um your book talks about how like Joseph Smith, likely similar to like Methodist Protestant preachers in his time, a similar technique of having sort of like a rough outline in his head, maybe either mental notes or physical notes, and then he would, similar to preachers, kind of like almost like modern day equivalent of like a bullet points, like expound and expand upon it, giving like a semi extemporaneous sort of oral dictation. So it wasn't like recited from memory. He didn't have like a manuscript where he was reciting word for word, but he also wasn't just making it up on the fly. And that you could see examples of what you would say are heads, either at the beginning of books, like in First Nephi, or even throughout certain parts of the narrative, that you would see this is Joe Smith using that sort of technique to dictate the Book of Mormon. Would you say that's a fair, sort of in a nutshell, layperson summary of your thesis, which will
Yeah.
go in a lot more depth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Super.
You know, obviously we can expand that out with being more precise because, you know, like when you say the bullet points, when you're talking about the series of heads creating an outline um, for a narrative, a story, then it's pretty much like bullet points. But if you're talking about a sermon, the bullet point part is only one component of a larger sermon pattern that's
Mm,
going on there. And
yeah.
you know, so there's more to explore. But
We
yeah, I mean
we talk about
that's fine.
sermon culture, or oral composition, and
Yeah,
maybe things like Joseph's maybe educational abilities as well. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I'll maybe interject with maybe the odd question or thought, or any
yeah.
pushback that people might give to your work towards the end. But I'm excited to dive in.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
So should we start with?
We can start with your slide. Yeah, the first slide.
Okay, I am going to start out by throwing people for a loop. And because I know that even when you're talking about material and someone even starts to think, you know, maybe this might be challenging in a way that is, uh, I'm going to shut my mind off. I want to do something that I hope is unique and let me, you know, and I'm still how I'm trying to do. I can't talk and do technology
Well,
at
while
the
you're loading
same
that up,
time.
I think it's an important skill for us as human beings to be able to do that, to talk to people who may have different views or present information that might challenge our views. It can be uncomfortable, but I think it's an important part of growth as a person.
Yeah,
If you live in sort of an chamber, or if you're not open to evolving your views or theories, while you can maybe hold to like certain beliefs or spiritual convictions, I think that's an important part of learning and progressing. That's one of the things that I've appreciated since doing this channel, is the opportunity to speak to different people who have different views, different theories, be it a different
yeah,
translation theory or a different geography theory or a naturalistic theory versus a faithful theory. It can be challenging, but it can also be helpful to learn more about these different views, and you can be more informed or have more understanding.
right. And I think you know what you're saying, being more informed. I think when we're talking about religion and we're talking about making decisions in our lives. These are things that shape the course of our entire lives. And so being more informed, in my opinion, is much better than just having a narrow set of information and then trying to use blinders or blindfolds to block everything else out. That is going to create problems, I think, for an individual when they come across information that they have to suddenly grapple with or
Right.
just and I don't think that's healthy for someone's faith and belief to go that way. Anyway, my opinion.
Yeah, no,
I
I
don't know
agree,
what.
because you can have a very simplistic faith as well, and you can be unaware. I felt growing up in the church, I had just a very simplistic, very literalistic view of the translation and the words, and it was definitely challenged after I mission learning about different critiques or different elements in the Book of Mormon. So I agree with you
Yeah,
there.
Um, I don't have any idea what can or can't be seen.
I
Um,
can see the slide.
okay.
Yeah, I can see them. I don't know if
So
you
I
can make it full screen. Oh, that yeah, that's it.
okay. So here is the book again, Visions in a Seer Stone. And when I said the making of the Book of Mormon, by the way, that was a general term to talk about what this book is about. And it's about how the book was constructed. And so there are people involved in the construction of this work. And, you have Mormon, Moroni, you have prophets writing. So it was intentionally generic and vague so that if people wanted to interpret that subtitle through a believing paradigm, you say, okay, this is how it was constructed through ancient prophets and whatnot. Or if people interpret it as Joseph Smith just fabricating himself, I mean, someone could look at it that way, but I intentionally did it
That was a bit ambiguous because I guess Joseph
ambiguous.
Smith, he's either involved as the translator of the record
Mhm.
or the author, so he is involved in the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to run through this. I have a tendency to talk too much. So I'm going to try to
I have the
keep
same
it
thing.
short and succinct. So anyway, oh, I can't see everything because I've got this little Zoom notes in front of me. But anyway, so what I want to first point out to people so that they understand how to understand this work is that it's an academic work. What does that mean? That means that when I'm writing this, I'm following academic standards for evidence. And so I'm not writing a devotional work where you draw your conclusions from religious faith or spiritual beliefs, but if you're making claims, you have to come up with evidence, verifiable evidence. And that's just so you can keep the a level playing field with other people. Now, sometimes people say, "Oh, if it's academic, it's secular and it's destroying faith." But that's not what it means because in religious studies, you have lots of people who belong to faith traditions. But what they're saying is you have to be in a neutral space. You can't impose your beliefs onto a scholar from a different religious tradition. And so
Right,
this is a way that Catholics and, Methodists and or even atheists and agnostics, they can all get together and still explore through an academic lens religious belief, religious thought, what it means to even have a religion. And then that way, but you're not privileging one group's religious beliefs over another.
right.
And so that's what I'm doing in here, and it's not attacking anyone's faith. And I'm going to give an example, like the first vision. So for people who were members of the church, Joseph Smith saying God the Father and Jesus Christ. I mean, that's a fact to people, in their religious belief and their faith. But that doesn't mean you're going to go to an academic conference and tell everybody else if you don't treat my belief as fact, well then you're deceiving, you're misusing the historical record and because you're not interpreting it the way that conforms to my beliefs, right?
Right. Yeah,
And
scholarship can't really determine whether or not Joseph Smith had his first vision or not, or determine the inspiration or divinity of a sacred text. That's what
right,
are the bounds of scholarship.
because otherwise it just gets into just it's not about academic scholarship and information and facts. It's just about opinions,
Hmm.
faith, my belief, my belief, your belief, my belief, your belief. You go
Sort of like
nowhere.
theological arguments, right?
Yeah. So anyway, that's when I'm writing this, I'm writing to an audience where I'm following these kind of
Right.
rules.
That's your approach. That's your sort of methodology that you're following.
And so when I came to this, I was trying to keep it neutral on matters of faith and belief. And people who read the book, I am not criticizing the faith. I'm not criticizing doctrines. I'm not criticizing official beliefs or even policies. But what I am doing, and this is where I've stepped on some people's toes, is that you have your core doctrine, and then around that doctrine, there are a lot of people who try to explain things, and so they start building up theories. And these are non-doctrinal. Some of them are traditional ones that we've had for a long time. It's just what's a popular idea, but they're not doctrinal. They're not core beliefs of the faith. But the problem is sometimes there are people who see their non-doctrinal theory, the one that they like to explain something, but they act and behave as though it's official doctrine, right? And so if something new comes out that kind of changes things in human beings, we don't like change. If new information or research comes out that they don't like, then they gird up and say, I'm a defender of the faith and I'm going to attack this theory, when in fact they're not defending the faith. In actuality, they're just defending their favorite non-doctrinal theory.
You. Right. Okay. I see.
And
Uh,
yeah,
I was just gonna ask, do you think that there's been a partial reaction for maybe certain defenders of the faith to your book? Because like you said, you didn't intend this to prove or disprove the Book of Mormon. That's not your approach. But I think probably some unbelievers or critics have appreciated your theory. Maybe they've used some of the arguments or things you talk about in your book as sort of almost like a weapon against faith. And maybe as well, maybe some believers who read it also feel like, oh, well, this almost could provide a plausible, naturalistic way could have done it. But do you see that as maybe part of it, as well as maybe how your book has been utilized?
yeah, and people will take information and use it however, once you put that information forward, um, people will grab onto that and put it towards whatever use that they feel is best for whatever um, agenda they want to put forward. And
Right.
and at some point there's no way to control how people are going to take information, how they're going to use it. Um, and the thing is that's interesting is even though we might talk about how there are critics who have pushed back against this work, in reality, and this might surprise people, the vocal critics of my work from the church are outnumbered by about 1 to 4, I think, is when I was looking at all the different reviews that have come out, uh, compared to the people who have reviewed the work and have included active members of the church who have had lots of really good and positive things to say about how this helps kind of expand our understanding and to think about the translation. So even though have been critics, they really are just a vocal minority.
Right.
And
Okay.
whether or not that helps people to kind of think, hey, it's kind of safe to look at this, and I'm not gonna, throw the baby out with the bathwater tomorrow and run away from the church and start drinking coffee and
Right.
having
Yeah.
wild sex with anybody I want.
Yeah,
It's
your theory for the Book of Mormon is not inconsistent necessarily with belief in the Book of Mormon or viewing it as a translation of an ancient text, but there's some who have maybe
right.
seen it as a challenge to,
Yeah,
to the Book of Mormon. And I'm all for, and we'll talk about this later, critically challenging different people's views or theories. I think that's a natural part of scholarship. So I think in a way that can be good as well for people to, look at challenge different views or different theories. But I appreciate you sharing that that's not necessarily has to be inconsistent with one's view of it
right.
being divine or a translation.
Right. And this can be applied. I think, while it might, for someone who's a critic of the church, it might provide them additional evidence to show how Joseph Smith could have constructed this on his own. You can also look at the same exact evidence and say, this is going to enhance my faith to understand what was really going on in this whole process, and what was this translation process for Joseph.
Right.
And so it can go either way. It just depends on how someone wants to use the information.
Got it. Okay.
So let's see. So anyway, this is where this kind of just repeats what we were just talking about. I'm trying to offer a neutral position. Um, it offers a non-religious, naturalistic explanation of how someone like Joseph Smith could produce a book like the Book of Mormon. But I do something else, like I mentioned, is that I also offer believing readers explicit, non-naturalistic explanations, showing that how you can incorporate this into faith without having everything fall apart. And so my question is, how many critics do that?
Hmm.
You know, if I'm trying to tear down the faith, then why am I offering believers a way
No, no,
that they
I
can,
definitely think that you're very sincere in that way, and that you don't have that that agenda, and that you are trying to be neutral in that way, which
yeah.
I think is appreciative for either a naturalistic or a believing explanation for the Book of Mormon.
So we'll move on. We might come back to that a little bit more too, but we'll move on because I want to do something where I'm going to go even further. And this is just kind of set up before we look at the actual theory itself, is I want, see, sometimes when we think, oh, it's academic, intellectual information, but that's, secondary to my spiritual confirmation of witnesses of truth, right?
Right.
That's what we're taught. So I'm going to go there, right? And what I mean is, I'm going to ask everybody who's watching this a serious question. And this, do you seriously believe that you can pray to find out the truth of something and that the Holy Ghost can confirm to you whether or not it's true? It's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer. But what I'm
Oh,
saying
in
is,
the Book of Mormon.
yeah, well, we'll look at the scripture because it's not just about the Book of Mormon. It's if you want to know the truth of all things, this is a way to do it. So what I'm going to say is, I'm not telling people how to use or interpret. What I am saying is, I'm going to share you some information. And instead of trying to understand it through reading the work of critics or supporters or whatever, you get to go straight to God yourself. And so here's my challenge to you, because if you really believe this, then pray about it. Find out yourself directly from the Spirit. I am not going to try to persuade anybody. I'm just going to lay this evidence out there. And instead of, going, and I'll tell you why I'm doing this too, is there are a lot of people who have written critical reviews of my book that did not understand the points I was making. And then when you read some of these critical um, attacks on the work, they're not actually giving you correct information about what my work actually contains. And so, and sometimes even people who have said good things about my book, they will say things here and there that actually
They maybe not fully
completely
understood it.
missed. Yeah.
Right.
And
That's
so,
important because you want to have clarity and understanding as well.
yeah. And this book is packed with information, and I can see how some people have had criticisms that actually I answered in the book, but the book is so densely packed with information, I can just see how someone could have actually just read past it and missed it. So there's lots of stuff going on. But anyway, coming back to this, if you trust that the Holy Ghost can speak directly to you, then I'm saying, let's look at this information, pray about it, think about it, do exactly what's going on in Moroni 10, 3 through 5. And so what's the pattern here? I exhort you when you read these things, ponder it in your hearts. Think about it. Don't just have a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, this doesn't fit what I think.
I
Just think about
pre-existing
it.
beliefs.
And then after you think about it, ask with a sincere heart. Meaning, if you come to it and you say, I don't care what he says, I'm not listening, and some people will have that bias, so they're prejudiced from the outset because, if this author is not current faithful member of the church, then I'm going to doubt every single thing that they say simply because of their status, you know?
Right.
And I can tell you there are plenty of faithful members of the church who are not actually producing faithful scholarship. We'll get to that too.
And this makes me think this is almost like your own. This is like William Davis's promise. You should have put this at the end of your book. But I also think about in the Doctrine and Covenants, when the Lord, through a revelation that Joseph Smith dictated to seek out like the best books, seek learning by study, and
Yeah.
also by faith. That learning and is both could be a spiritual but also an intellectual endeavor as well. And that I feel like
Right.
God wants us to seek out the best books, the best scholarship, the best information on a topic. Like the glory of God is intelligence as well. And I think there's that famous quote from Joseph that Mormonism seeks, to embrace truth no matter where it comes from. So I think
Yeah.
it's important to be open-minded and to be open to sort of intellectual research and scholarship as well, and incorporate that into our beliefs. And we don't necessarily have to abandon people's spiritual convictions or experiences because of these things, but to try to maybe refine or be more flexible in their intellectual views.
My dad used to say something that you've probably heard before, an old adage, but it says, even a stopped watch will tell the correct time twice a day. And that stuck with me. He said that when I was a kid. So just consider the possibility that even though people may look at me as being a stopped watch, consider the possibility that there are a couple times during the day I'm giving you the correct time.
And I think as well that people may even feel, because I find this with a lot of people I've listened to, that may not agree or align with everything in their theory, but there's definitely something that you can learn. I'm sure there's something that they will teach you from their view, their theory, that their position that you can learn from and sort of apply or evolve your own view as well. So I think that's an important
Yeah.
part, to be open-minded to learn from other people's views or theories.
And then coming down here. So what this means when I'm going back to Moroni and his promise. So you ponder something, you ask with a sincere heart, with real intent. I mean, you genuinely want to know, because if you shut off your mind before you even ask, you're not going to get a revelation of anything. And then finally, down here on verse 5, it's not just the Book of Mormon, by the power of the Holy Ghost, ye may know the truth of all things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to discovering whether or not the Book of Mormon is true, but whether or not there are certain principles or ideas that could be true. And then if you listen and you're open to the Holy Ghost, um, then you give yourself the opportunity whether or not to have something verified or not.
Hmm.
Okay. And so what I'm saying is, I'm not saying you have to think a certain way. What I'm saying is, I'm going to present a bunch of information to people. Some of it will be new, some of it will be different. And just to kind of try not to have that knee-jerk reaction, just listen to it, think about it, ponder, pray about it, and then trust that you can have answers from the Holy Ghost too, and that you don't have to read everybody else's summary. And I would say, if you really want to know what I said, read the book, and you don't have to buy it. I mean, this isn't a sales pitch. If you want to check it out from a library, check it out
I'll
from a
put a link
library.
though. I'll put a link in where
Okay.
they can get it.
So anyway, I think I get the point. Now, from here, what I want to do is to kind of position this work in relation to other theories that we have about how the translation of the Book of Mormon. And so the work that I'm doing embraces what's known as loose control. Loose control, that sees Joseph Smith as an actual translator. So when Joseph Smith said, I translated the Book of Mormon, he really meant he translated the Book of Mormon. He was actively involved in that process, meaning that he received some kind of imagery or visions or ideas, impressions, which then he described and articulated using his own vocabulary, language structures, concepts, and story patterns. And so the
Right.
Book of Mormon, that has been filtered through his mind. Tight control is that Joseph Smith actually did not translate anything. It's just all the words were provided to him, whether on a seer stone, Urim and Thummim interpreters. And so this is a passive process where he's just kind of seeing, and he's not a translator, he's a transcriber
He's reading the
and
translation.
just reading the translation. And then some people have, tried to say maybe it's a combination of things. Maybe sometimes he was getting it directly. The words were given to him directly, and other times, there was more latitude to, so those are some of them. But I'm just saying that I position this where Joseph Smith was what he said he was, a translator.
Hmm.
Now, in terms of the translation process, we tend to think of the translation as happening right as soon as 1829 hits. So Joseph Smith, he gets the plates. There's the first 116 page loss that kind of throws everything off schedule, but then The translation begins on April of 1829.
Right.
What I'm saying in this is that the translation began sooner. In fact, what I'm arguing here is that Moroni, when he appeared to Joseph Smith, he was right from the start trying to get Joseph ready for the translation by preparing him and teaching him, telling him about the Book of Mormon, and then getting Joseph involved in the process by learning how to listen to the spirit and the guidance for this gift of translation. So when we start out September 1823, that's when Joseph tells his family about the Book of Mormon. So that's where we know that Moroni visited and this information is starting to be shared.
Right.
The next thing we want to look at is in the late 1827 to early 1828 is the first time he started on the translation. We don't know exactly when it was. It could have been November, December of 1827, or it was during the winter, so it could have been January, February of 1828. But that's when they started with 116 pages. But then we know what happened. The pages get lost. But what this tells us right away is that from the time Moroni first came until the first time they started onto the dictation of the Book of Mormon, that was 4 years. So that's 4 years of this preparation of Moroni, who's visiting Joseph Smith, to get him up to speed to be able to perform this work.
Right.
And, because otherwise, I mean, yeah, think about it. Moroni comes down, he kind of shares the story of the Book of Mormon, and but don't worry about it. You're not even going to be doing this for years away. I just tell you the story, but we're going to drop it, and then we'll come back. I think that's not what happened. I think what happened is that Joseph Smith was being prepared this whole time, and that he was doing preliminary work on the translation. So anyway,
Right.
back to the timeline. In April to June of 1829 is when the final dictation of the Book of Mormon as we have it today took place. But see, that was another year and a half after that where there was more time to get this process down. So when you look at the entire time from the announcement of Moroni of what's going to happen to when they finally start dictating, that's 5.5 years for whatever preliminary translation processes that Joseph Smith was going through would have been taking place.
Yeah.
And so
And
the
critics
new,
as well, under more of a naturalistic theory, if you believe Joseph Smith is the author and created the story of the angel and the plates, they would also argue that, well, Joseph had 5.5 years to sort of come up with the narrative of the Book of Mormon as well, flush out the story. And I know you got some slides about some of
yeah.
the retellings he did to his family members.
Yeah, so you can look at this either way. Part of it is preliminary translation work. Part of it is just Joseph Smith writing it on his own or figuring it out on his own in the background. I'm not telling people what to think. I'm just saying that these are some of the basic facts. He
Right.
did have this amount of time
Hmm.
between the announce. So regardless what we believe, you had this period of time out there.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So, again, that means 4 years of initial preparation and revisions, 5.5 years total time with a little more preparation. There's some practice. He's already dictated a little bit. Now he's would have developed that skill. And so in time, when you start doing the 1829 final dictation of the Book of Mormon, you have all these um, developments that have occurred. So we're going to go through this, and I'm intentionally uh, describing these events with a believer's bias so that people can understand
Right.
and think about how this works within a paradigm of faith. So when Joseph Smith's 17 years old, um, the angel Moroni comes and visits him. And then there's something here that I've noticed that people don't always realize. When Moroni first visited Joseph, he gave him a summary, like a Reader's Digest version of the entire Book of Mormon at that time. He didn't just say, oh, there's this record about these people. Don't worry about all the stories. I'll get to it later. He actually told them a brief outline of what's going on, their lives, their stories, religious beliefs, civilizations, righteousness, wickedness, and their eventual demise. How do we know this? Well, here's the famous quote that people usually turn to,
Hmm.
Lucy's book. So Joseph Smith is speaking to the angel Moroni, and then Joseph is just blown away by this information. So he starts to share it with the family. And then Lucy describes how during our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of travel, the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. By the way, some people have said that, all these details, you don't see this in the Book of Mormon. Yes, you do. And in my book, when I talk about this, in the parentheses, I say, go to this scripture, that scripture, the other scripture, where each one of these things is mentioned in the story, but it's incorporated into the narrative.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Talks about animals, talks about at least dress, like costly apparel. Definitely describes cities and warfare. So yeah, a lot of those elements are in the Book of Mormon. Of course, critics they might view that this is Joseph sort of practicing and sort of inventing these stories, which later maybe
Mhm.
made their way into the Book of Mormon. That being more the naturalistic theory. I've heard different believers or apologists posit that either this is coming from what Joseph is being told by the ancient Moroni, what he is instructing and telling him about the former inhabitants, or perhaps Joseph might have been shown visions, perhaps in his
Mhm.
encounters with Moroni, that he's seeing this and then he's relating this to his family members. It could be either of those,
Could be
three
either. Yeah.
possibilities.
Hmm. So this is what people tend to focus on. But when this sounds like it's not really necessarily tied to the Book of Mormon. However, when you look at this in connection, Lucy's not the only one who mentioned these nightly conversations. She's certainly the only one who mentioned in detail, but her son William, Joseph's brother, also referred back to when they had these conversations. And when he was describing what Joseph told them, this is what he said. He's talking about how Joseph shared a short account of the inhabitants who formerly resided upon this continent, a full history of whom, he said, was engraved on some plates which were hidden. So Joseph Smith wasn't just told various little tidbits and trivia information about the Book of Mormon people. He was actually given a short account, a Reader's Digest version of the Book of Mormon, the full account or the elaborated, amplified information of which was actually on the plates.
Hmm. Interesting.
So
So you would
that's
say
a,
he was given some sort of a rough overview or summary, basically, of what would be contained on the record of the gold plate from Moroni.
yeah. And then there's one more thing because this is from Lucy, this is from William, but we have something from Joseph Smith himself where he described what went on. So Joseph Smith wrote a letter to a guy named John Wentworth. And John Wentworth he was a newspaper editor, the Chicago Democrat. He wanted to just give, information about this new religion. So he wrote to Joseph Smith and he said, here, I'm going to tell you about it. In the course of this letter where he's telling John Wentworth about the rise and origins, he mentions where he's talking about Moroni's visit, and this is from the article where it says on the evening of the 21st of September AD 1823. So when Joseph Smith was talking to him, he says at this time during this visit, Joseph said, "This is what Moroni shared with him. I, Joseph, was also informed by Moroni concerning the aboriginal inhabitants of this country. I was shown who they were, where they came from, a brief sketch of their origins, their progress, civilization, laws, governments, righteousness and iniquity, the blessings of God finally being withdrawn from them as a people." this is a lot more than how they dressed up or what kind of animals they rode on. I mean, and if you think about each of these, like when it says their governments, you say, well, what governments were there in the Book of Mormon? Well, you have kings, but then you also have them switching to judges.
Right.
And then at one point, when they fall apart, they turn into tribes. So if Joseph Smith's being told about these different governments, they're connected to the parts of the story in which those governments take place. And so there's more detail than just said kingship, tribalism, judgeship. There's going to be connected to it. And when you talk about their origin, what's their origin? So the people came from Jerusalem, their
Right.
progress, um, how they developed from this initial migration into these fully developed civilizations, the development of their laws. And then when it talks about righteousness and iniquity, there's going to be some kind of detail attached to that information to explain what that is. And we say the blessings finally being withdrawn from it's just the collapse and annihilation of this particular civilization.
Right. So you're saying that he was informed, sort of told by Moroni, and he says in his own words, shown. So maybe again could be some sort of vision of sort of like a rough outline or a summary basically of the things that would happen in the Book of Mormon. This is coming from Joseph Smith as well as his family members are implying this as well.
Yeah. So, like you said, he's getting a pretty good detailed panoramic view of the whole thing in like, a big wide shot, but it's
Yes.
not detailed yet. By the way, down here on brief sketch, now most of us today just think of that as like a brief outline. That is a term actually that's in sermon culture.
Mm,
And brief sketch is one of the names, one of the terms that was used for this process called laying down heads. A brief sketch was an outline of heads that preachers used to preach a sermon.
right.
I didn't mention that in the book, so that's a little tidbit.
That's
So when
interesting.
Joseph Smith, when he's describing this, he used some, and we're going to talk about this in a second. So he's describing what Moroni told him in the language of sermon culture, in the language of introductory composition of these outlines. So it's just it's another little extra bit of information to kind of plug in the back of the mind. Okay, so once again, back to the timeline. We've got this September 1823 start. We've got the false start in 1827. We've got these 4 years from the false start, 5.5 years to the final text. And so the question is, what is happening during this time? My theory is that Joseph Smith was not just sitting on his hands waiting for this to come about in terms of the Book of Mormon. What I am arguing here and what I think there's evidence for is that Joseph Smith, under Moroni's direction, was starting preliminary preparations to do this work. And what did that include? From the beginning, in September 1823, after Moroni told him this entire history, he starts then to prepare for the Book of Mormon. These preparations involved preliminary work on the translation. And so he pondered on the stories that Moroni told him. He sought spiritual guidance to discover more details about the Book of Mormon people and their history, because he's going to have to produce this detailed work, and that these meditations were an integral part of the translation process. Why am I saying that? Well, because that's kind of what the Lord described as the gift of translation. So what I'm arguing here is that Joseph Smith followed the same translation process using the same gift of translation that the Lord described to Oliver Cowdery when Oliver attempted but failed to translate a portion of the Book of Mormon. So we're going to go over and take a look at that.
Okay.
So Oliver tried. He said, "Here, let me have a chance. I want to give a shot at this translation." So Joseph Smith said, "Okay, here you go." And then Oliver just oh, I can't make it work. What's going on? And so Joseph Smith, I know what's last the Lord. So the Lord comes back and he says, behold, you, Oliver, have not understood. You have supposed that I would give it, the translation, I would give it unto you, when you took no thought, save it was to ask me. In other words, he's saying, you just thought I was just going to give you the translation. You didn't have to do anything. All you thought you had to do is just ask me for it, and then boom, I give you all the words. So that's a passive translation. He's just expecting the words to come. But then the Lord says this, but behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind. And then you must ask me if it be right. So this is active forethought, active engagement. This goes way beyond simply reading pre-existing words.
Right.
And if it is right, so you're going to do this kind of trial and error process. You're going to think about this. You're going to try to figure out in your mind how this story goes or what this ancient prophet is saying. And when you get it right, you're going to get this reinforcement of the spirit. If it's right, I'll cause your bosom to burn within you, a spiritual confirmation. Therefore, you will feel that it is right. If it's not right, you're not going to have this feelings. You're going to have a stupor of thought and you'll forget the thing that was wrong. And then he comes back to Oliver's. Now, if you had known this, you could have translated. Okay, so what this tells us about the translation process is that it's not you just sit there and God suddenly throws all the words and you just, you're like a funnel, where God just funnels all the words straight through you. This is the person's involved. They have to study it out. They have to look for confirmation. And then when it finally feels right, then that's when you start dictating. And see, the problem here is when we look at Joseph Smith and the dictation, he wasn't going through this process during the dictation.
Hmm. Because I was going to ask a question or a slight pushback because I
Yeah.
agree with those passages that I would lean towards. I think Joseph was actively participating in the translation, that he was the translator rendering it in his language and his vocabulary, and that there was an intellectual component. My understanding, I think a lot of believers would probably say that they would interpret that as that the studying out in his mind was when he was maybe being provided the meaning of the translation, he was having to study and then put it into his own language. And they might say that you're theorizing that the studying it out in his mind happened before the translation, and maybe they might say
Before.
like, is there evidence for that?
Well,
You might
part
be
of it is when you look at all of the eyewitness accounts, none of them are saying that Joseph Smith sat there thinking, pondering, and then he gave his sentence, they repeated it back, and then he went back to thinking, pondering, and then no one describes that kind of process. What was happening is Joseph dictated a sentence, they read it back, and as soon as it was corrected, then he went right into the next sentence. It was read back to him, then he went right into the sentence. There's no space in any of the eyewitness accounts that describes this pausing and thinking and studying it out
So you would believe, you would theorize that the studying out in his mind took place prior,
before.
the years prior, and also would you view it as maybe in between as well, that there was some pondering, studying, or or do you think that the story was already quite clearly mapped out before the dictation began?
I think that the story was mapped out before
Okay.
the dictation began, but not entirely. Because, see, even in that process, there still has to be space for continued revelation. And I think also when you look at the text of the Book of Mormon and you look at how these preparatory outlines interact with the text, they don't always track directly against each other. And so I think what was happening is even though Joseph Smith had worked out a more detailed outline, that even during the translation, he was still open to inspiration. We talk
Mhm.
about that a little bit here too.
Can I ask one more pushback?
Yeah,
Because some
yeah.
people might think that, well, Joseph Smith, he translated with the seer stone, so someone might hold the view of Joseph was sort of reading off the seer stone, but this revelation to Oliver Cowdery, that's more in reference to his dowsing or divining rod. So maybe Oliver had to use a different method of translation. Do you have a quick response? Because I'm just thinking somebody might posit that as a pushback.
Sure. So you have to ask why someone would even try to make that argument in the first place. Because people who make that argument, generally it's because they have a theory that they hold to and they want to undermine um, this example of how translation works. And it's usually people who are in the camp of tight control.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Because that way you can say Oliver uh, his process of working it out in his mind and everything else was not Joseph's process. Joseph just read it off the seer stone. But with Oliver, it was a totally different method. And then, part of you have to answer why. Well,
Why is it a different method for Oliver
why?
than Joseph?
Yeah, I mean, what? And then also you have a dowsing rod. How is he supposed to see words on the dowsing rod? It's like this tiny little ticker tape, like a New York Stock Exchange thing running across like ants, and he's got to see it. You know, sometimes these things aren't well thought through. But to answer this more broadly, a lot of times when people are come to that conclusion, they're looking at D&C chapter 9 in isolation of the other early revelations. This is not the only revelation that was given to Oliver Cowdery, talking to Oliver Cowdery about the gift of his gifts of revelation.
Right.
And it's
That's
a
true.
little confusing because when you talk about revelation and the gifts of revelation, the gift of translation is a form of revelation. The gift of being able to just speak, ask a question of God and receive impressions, that's another type of revelation. And then he also had this dowsing rod. When you go in, there's three, and these are just offhand, so I might have them wrong, but it's not just DNC 9, but also DNC 8. And then I also believe it was DNC 6.
That's
And
correct.
then
Yeah.
don't just look at them in the Doctrine and Covenants, but on the Joseph Smith papers, you can actually go back to the original Book of Commandments, which was like what 1835 ish,
I
and
think
look at the.
1833 for the Book of
Is it
Commandments.
1833?
I think so,
Yeah,
yeah.
and look at them there because the language has been changed a little bit from our modern ones.
That's right, yeah.
And then when you go through, and it is confusing because these gifts are overlapping, but when you go through, you find out that those revelations refer to three different gifts. There is Oliver's personal revelation, no objects involved.
Mm-hmm.
There's Oliver's gift of revelation through the divining rod, object involved.
Which I believe the language has changed now in our Doctrine and Covenants thing, the 1835 edition to the gift of Aaron, which I never knew what that
Yeah.
was as a missionary. I remember reading it, be like, what is this gift of Aaron? I was like, well, Aaron's a spokesperson. But then it says like how you've held it in your hands and it's told you many things. I'm like, wait, what on earth is this? And then I didn't learn until after my mission that, oh, okay, it's a divining rod, because that was what I think in
Yeah.
the early Book of Commandments it was like dowsing rod or gift of the sprout or something like that.
Rod of nature, I
Rod of
think is
nature, okay.
how they describe it. And so he has that gift. But when you look closely at it, um, the revelations are saying that if you want the gift of translation, then use your gift of the divining rod or use your personal gift to ask for this gift so that you can do this too. But and when you look at the language, and I go into more detail in this in another document, but when you look at the language, there are clear separations between what these gifts do and don't do. And even though you can use those gifts to then ask for the gift of translation, it's not the gift itself. And there's a clear distinction made between the gift of the rod, which they say Oliver has, and yet it's different from the gift of translation, which he does not have yet. If the gift of translation was one of the powers of the divining rod, then he would have already had it and wouldn't need to ask for it. And that will make more sense when you actually go
Mm-hmm.
to the original and look at those. And so finally, the gift of translation then is something that's separate from these other two.
Yeah, got you.
So when it comes to the gift of translation, this is not the trying to say this was Oliver using his dowsing rod. It's clear, it's muddy. But when you look at it, you realize that the the divining rod is not the instrument that was being used for translation.
Okay. I have one last question because I'm conscious of the time because we got a lot to get through, but I have one last
Oh
question.
yeah.
Somebody might say that, okay, you believe the studying out in his mind, sort of mapping out the story narrative, which he sort of got in a brief sketch from Moroni is between 1823 to 1829. Somebody might ask then why did he have to wait until he received the plates in order to start dictating the Book of Mormon? It almost seems like he could have dictated or translated the Book of Mormon without the plates or before even getting the plates. Do you have a quick response to, because somebody might say that, oh no, the translation only began once he got the plates through the translation instruments?
Yeah, well, I would say, well, for one thing, the Book of Mormon has a lot of stories and it's long and complex. You're going to need a lot of time to do the preparation work to get there.
Mm,
And so because of that, um, when it comes to why all of a sudden does he have the plates, that's not just for Joseph's benefit. That's for the benefit of people to believe.
right,
I mean,
yeah, that's true.
that's why we have the witnesses saying, I held the plates, and so it played more than simply a role in the translation. The presence of the plates was to give this tangible manifestation of the truthfulness of the record, and therefore the truthfulness of the restoration and Joseph's involvement.
Right, that's true. A lot of apologists would make that same argument as well, because many believe that it was primarily either the seer stone or the spectacles put in the hat, and the plates may not always have been out in front of him, so they may not have been used in the translation, but there's still sort of like that tangible evidence of sort of the Book of Mormon, and you've got the witnesses. So no, that was a good response.
And just something to add on top of that. I mean, once Joseph Smith, he's got his seer stone during this whole, ever since 1823, he's got a seer stone. So if you wanted to do it differently, I mean, you could have left the plates buried in the hill. You never had to bring them out of the hill. You just look in your seer stone, and you're going to, through a visionary experience, be able to see everything on the plates. So the plates coming out of the hill, the plates being seen and witnessed, that the important thing is for how that builds other people's testimonies.
Okay, alrighty.
Okay. So anyway, coming back over the next of the course of this time period of preparation, he prepared for the dictation of the Book of Mormon by expanding on Moroni's brief sketch to create more detailed outlines of the work. And this is what we talked about, studying out the Book of Mormon in his mind, seeking spiritual confirmation along the way. And then as part of that process, Joseph took, I'm arguing, brief notes on what he was discovering through this process of divine revelation and making short, concise sketches of these narratives, which he would usually use later to help refresh his memory before each of the dictation sessions.
Okay, question slash
Yeah.
we push back. Somebody might say, okay, well, it's possible that under your theory that he'd been studying out, the story of the Book of Mormon in his mind from 1823 to 1829, and it's like possible that maybe he could have been writing down notes, and that could also work for a naturalistic theory. But someone might say, first of all, like, there's no like evidence that we find that he had notes that he was writing this down. Could have been mental notes. And somebody might say, "Oh, my brain's just forgotten. What's the second point I was going to make?"
Paper.
Bop bop bop. I had another point and I can't remember what it was. It was good though.
Okay.
Maybe it'll come back to me. If it comes back to me, I'll interject what it was.
Okay. So, first of all,
Oh,
when
it came back to me. Sorry.
yeah.
So they might say the quote from Emma Smith that she gave her final testimony when she talks about the
Oh, yeah.
translation and dictation of the Book of Mormon. I'm doing this from memory, so I don't know if she mentions notes specifically, but I know she said that there's
No.
no book or manuscript. So somebody might
Right.
interpret that. I'm pretty sure whenever I read through some of the uh, testimony of some of the witnesses of the translation, I think some of them said that he wasn't working off either notes or manuscripts. So someone might say, like, well, none of the witnesses say he had notes, and they might have called him out they saw him like, I'm going to refer to my notes here.
Mhm.
What's your response to that?
We get to that.
Okay.
I have a slide on that.
Okay.
Um, so let's not forget that.
We'll come back to that.
Um, what was the first question you had, though?
The first point I had, is if somebody were to say that there's no evidence that
Oh,
Joseph
okay.
was writing down notes, like if we find a letter book with all like the headings or the laying down heads, then that would be really strong evidence for your theory. But it's sort of like this is just speculation, so to speak.
Oh, well, kind of. There's different types of evidence. There's external evidence and there's internal evidence. When you're looking at external evidence, that's like, finding a notebook that has outlines of heads. And stop and think a second, even if Joseph Smith were doing this inspired and someone found an outline book, they might think, oh my gosh, Joseph made this up. You're not going to keep that and just set it around. Hey, look, everybody see.
Okay.
But something that's even more important here, though, is when people say we don't have a historical reference that describes him doing this, we're talking about a time period before Joseph Smith was even known. When we go back to 1829 or you go to 1828, if you want to find any evidence of Joseph Smith doing anything at all, it's almost nothing in the historical record. I
Because
mean,
he didn't start writing his first journal to 1832. Maybe the odd reference from neighbors, but even they come later after
everything
the
else is
beginning of the
coming later.
church.
If
Yeah.
if you're looking for a source, not a reflection back onto that time, but one coming from that time, I think you have Joseph Smith signing a document, some court documents related to his father and a legal uh, issue going on. Um, I think, you can find there's a docket for Joseph Smith when he was on trial for being a glass looker. But as far as like details about what's Joseph Smith's daily life like, what's going on in his school, what's happened, there is just nothing
Yeah.
of any kind. So when someone, tries to derail an argument saying, "Well, we don't have this reference," it's really kind of disingenuous because there aren't records for virtually 99.9% of what Joseph Smith was ever doing at all in any way in his life that are contemporary with that time.
Okay. If I were to reframe the statement to say that, okay, he could have been consulting notes as part of the translation theory. So he may have had written out notes on paper, but also he may not have because we don't have, say, tangible evidence of that. What would you think about that? Is that a better reframe?
Oh, yeah. So we're talking about, for me anyway, this is kind of about two different things.
Okay.
So I'll get to the note when I was talking about external evidence and internal evidence. I think there's an abundance of internal evidence to show
Right.
that he had done this,
Okay. Got
even
you.
even though there might not be observers. But when you see the tracks of an animal going through the yard, you don't have evidence of, maybe you don't have a photograph of the animal going through, but if you got the tracks, you got really strong
Right. So you think there's
circumstantial
internal
evidence,
evidence in the text
internal.
showing this? Right.
Yeah.
Got you.
And so what I'm saying about this other thing about during the time period of when Joseph Smith would have going through this process, what I'm trying to say there is, well, there are a few things. One, at that time period, Joseph Smith was living with his family in this tiny cabin for part of the time. And then another part of the time, after they built a frame house, it was still small. And in this cabin, there were 10 people living in this little place. There's no place. If Joseph Smith is trying to work out these outlines and you're staying at home with all little brothers and sisters screaming with people coming in and out of the house, there's nowhere to go to have privacy. More than likely, that's Joseph would not be trying to do this careful trial and error spiritual work in the middle of a madhouse. So there's just some things that are kind of common sense, I would think. The family has this tradition of when you're trying to do spiritual thing or spiritual answers, then you go out into the local orchard or somewhere else where you can just have some calm and peace and where you can think about spiritual things, read the scriptures. Joseph's mother did that. Joseph did it several times
Right.
throughout his life. And then the other thing I think I've heard that's related to this is people saying, well, there, we don't see Joseph surrounded by lots of expensive paper and he's constantly revising and doing all these things and he couldn't afford this paper and stuff. Um, this process does not involve a lot of paper. I mean, the process is something that is a mental exercise. In sermon culture, for example, when a preacher is trying to come up with a sermon and he's on his circuit route and he's riding from one town to the other in the saddle of a horse, he's not going to suddenly pull out his ink bottle and then pull out his quill pen and get his, he's trying to juggle things or trying to write his. That's not how it worked. The reason why they even did this method in the first place is because what they did is they would meditate. They say, okay, I want to do a sermon on such and such scripture. And so they think about it. And you're riding your horse and you think, I could talk about this subject. I could talk about that. Oh, maybe, yeah, no, I'll switch around the arrangement. I'll talk about this part first, then that part. And so there's kind of mental thinking about it, kind of what you want to talk about, kind of rearranging things. And then finally, when you get to your destination, that's when they might just sketch out a little outline. And that's all they would need is this tiny little outline that fit on a slip of paper.
Hmm.
And so when I've seen people say, well, we don't have any evidence of Joseph using all of this expensive paper and writing out and revising, it's that this just that is not how it worked. What if someone were to come across Joseph Smith doing the preparation using this method? What would they see? What would they observe? They would observe basically Joseph Smith daydreaming and thinking and meditating, lost in thought. That's what we would see. Incidentally, Lucy describes Joseph Smith that way.
Right.
He didn't like to read very much, or he didn't read as much as our other children, but he was lots deep in thought all the time.
Right. He ponder and meditate. And we even see that in Joe Smith's in some of his first vision accounts. He would talk about that, reflecting and
Yeah.
pondering on the scriptures and thinking about, the things of his soul. So no, I get that point.
So we'll go forward and I'll say that we can still see some of those outlines. And this is what I'm talking about as internal evidence. So some of these outlines are actually right there in the text for us to look at. He incorporated them also as chapter headings, these summaries, as well as incorporating them into the text themselves. Now, I know where the questions are going to pop up here too, but when you look at this for a second, this is the opening of First Nephi, an account of Lehi and his wife Sariah and his four sons being called at the beginning at the eldest, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. And then in modern ones, we have this dash. In the original 1830, it was a period. It didn't matter. But then you go, the Lord warns Lehi to depart out of the land of Jerusalem, and then so it just kind of tracks through the whole narrative. So this is what would be called a sketch outline or a brief outline.
Yeah.
Or short notes. I mean, there's several different terms for it.
I would call it in my vocabulary a wee summary.
A wee summary.
A wee summary.
I love that. And so what I'm arguing is that we can actually see this in the text. We can actually see the notes, and that these were the guides that Joseph Smith used. So let's go to sermon culture. Joseph's note-taking technique was the exact same technique that many preachers used to compose their sermons, as well as public speakers and storytellers. They also used it, and even some children wasn't really so much in the common school system. So I don't know. I don't think that Joseph would have learned this in common school. But as you tried to get more education beyond a common school setting, then you would come into introductory composition lessons where they use this same exact method. But among preachers, it was called laying down heads. It was really popular among the evangelical preachers. And when I say the evangelicals, those are the guys who would get up and do these very emotional speeches, and people would be swooning and passing out and all that. But they were not getting up. Some of the old school preachers at this time, if you go along the Eastern Seaboard and some of the traditional Congregationalists, they might stand up with a pre-written sermon and just kind of read it off. But these guys said, "Oh, that's terrible because if you're reading it, you're giving no space for the Spirit to guide you and what to say, and it's
Right.
dead, spiritually dead." And so they had their battles about this. So
That's
laying
fine
down
because this
heads.
doesn't sound super foreign. Because even for Latter-day Saints at church, we'll see some people who'll read their talks word for
Hmm.
word, but then you'll get some people who'll go up and they'll maybe have a sheet of paper and they'll probably have maybe little bullet points or little points almost similar to this, although it's not the same technique. But they'll be able to expound and just be able to orally speak their
Yeah.
sermon without having to read. So it doesn't seem like something that's too far into what we might see at church from certain people. And there's even some people that go up and give a 20-minute talk and they have no notes. Maybe they should have some notes, might help certain people, but
Yeah.
but this was something that they were all they were aware of it being called like this laying down heads technique. And you're saying that
Hmm.
they were taught this in some children learned it in sort of like an introduction to composition,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, you learn this a lot of different ways. I have, if we do get to it, I have a little more information about all the different ways that people learned about laying down heads, because heads, just that concept of heads being the main topic, that was universally known at this time. It's kind of new and foreign to us, and because we
Does it
use
just mean like
different
main
language.
points
Yeah,
heads?
it's
Okay.
exactly main points, main topics. Yeah. And so what they would do is, so how it worked, long before delivering a sermon, preachers prepared their ideas in advance. They made a brief outline or a brief sketch of the main points they wanted to share. Those points were called heads. They were short memory cues. They were just enough information to cue their memory. It could be a single word, it could be a short phrase, or even a sentence. And then they use these as guides for the sermon. And they're flexible guides. So that if they're up there and they're preaching and all of a sudden they feel inspired to go off in a whole new direction, they can. But because it's still, if they go off in this direction, suddenly they finish the point and they go, oh no, what do I do now? They can always come back
Right. Gives them
to
some
it.
structure.
And in speaking by, that's something that you can refer to as resumptive repetition. But anyway, that's in the book. It's a little bit more complicated, but it's something that also appears frequently in the book.
Hmm.
But anyway, that's because somebody is following a mental guide. And so they can go and depart, but come back to it, go and depart and come back to it. Okay. Something else to know about this. And again, there's way too much information on a slide. And so for people who are watching this, don't create slides with this much wording on it. Uh, the reason it's a terrible way to do a presentation, I apologize. It's because I'm working on a different document where I have to explain everything, and those bad habits came over here. Anyway, so in sermon culture, they created their sermon outlines. The way that they would create these, and because, they're preachers, what are they preaching from? The Bible. They're working with their Bibles all the time. And we have the same, what they're using as a performance guide is the same style of what you have in biblical summaries. But the biblical summaries are different because they're written finding aids. So they provide a summary that tracks the main points of an oration or a written text. So over here, down at the bottom left, I have sermon notes. We'll look closer at these.
Hmm.
And then on the bottom right, we have biblical summaries. And the point is the way they set this up with, heads and keywords, just enough information to tell you what's happening in the course of a chapter. They're using the same technique, but the preachers are using it in order to structure and guide sermons, but it's also tied to and related to the way that they structure a summary heading for a chapter in a Bible. So it's a biblical apparatus. Now, I wanted people to see this. There's a Baptist preacher named Abraham Marshall, and his son published his memoir, and in the back, he said, "Oh, we're publishing a bunch of scripture annotations." But later, the grandson, who was also a preacher, said, they're not scripture annotations. These were sermon notes. And so this is how the sermon is structured. And so I pulled one of them so that you can kind of see how it works, both for the preaching pattern of laying down heads, as well as how this works in a sermon that follows a narrative or a story. So when you start out up here at the top, see that VI? That's just saying that this is the numbers, this is the sixth sermon pattern. So that's not actually part of the short notes. You have numbers, the tiny X for 10, chapter 10, and then 29. So verse 29. And then in this italics here, come thou with us, and etc. That's just a shortened uh, form of the scripture. That's just enough so that he will remember what this is about. And what this is about is when Moses was going to Canaan, he had this friend named Hobab, and he said, "Do you want to come along with us? It's going to be great. Canaan's going to be awesome." And so when they had something called laying down heads is when a preacher got up, and if he wanted the audience to know all of the main points that he was going to hit during the sermon, then he would announce them. And that was one of the definitions of laying down heads. So he would get up and he'd say, "Today we're going to talk about this scripture. Come thou with us." And Moses and Hobab. And what we learn from this scripture is we learn about how this applies to our lives. And we're going to talk about their leaving Egypt, and then we'll talk about their journey, and then they're talk about where they're going, and then we'll talk about what good it's going to do to you. And so that's he's giving them explicit summary of what he's about to talk to them about.
It's almost similar to me at the start of an interview. Sometimes I'll give like a little summary of this is what we're hoping to cover in this,
Yeah.
beforehand, and then you hopefully remember to touch on each point. I don't have this though. I don't have a laying down heads sheet in front of me. I probably should. I do have notes though that I have written down.
Yeah, but we do this stuff, and it's not like we recreated it. These are traditions that go way back, and a lot of stuff that we learned in school about composition, you can actually trace back how it developed out of earlier forms of composition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is one that you call laying down heads, where they explicitly lay down the heads. Now, sometimes when the preacher wanted the audience to have the experience of everything coming unpremeditated, straight from the Spirit, if you announce, "Here are the 4 points we're going to cover," then that tells the audience, "Oh, this is premeditated. You've planned it in advance." So sometimes they would not tell people these heads. They would just go straight into it. Or they might announce ahead as they go. And Abraham Marshall's notes here, this is actually kind of unusual for him. He if he delivered the way his notes are, he's someone who did not announce the heads in advance most of the time. And so that just meant that he was really trying to share with his audience that wherever he went with the sermon, he was following inspiration. Anyway, coming back to this, so we get the four main heads, and then he goes back to it. So number one, I'm not sure if you can read that, Israel in bondage and prison, and it switches to the Arabic numerals.
Uh,
1, 2, 3.
oh yes, I can. Yeah.
So that these are subdivisions of the first head. So the first head is they're leaving Egypt. And so these are the subheads for that. They're in bondage in prison. They're willing to go. God sent Moses to call them. Oh, now it's hard to get them to go. But then they were brought by the power of God. They left Egypt, traveled 3 days in the wilderness, crossed the sea. And after cross the sea, you notice go back to Roman numerals 2. Now, if you go up to top, it says their journey. So
Mm-hmm.
down here at Roman numerals 2, we're on the subdivisions of their journey. So what is their journey? They sang God praises during the journey. They were led by a cloud. They drank of the rock. They gathered manna. They had to fight. And then also Roman numerals number 3. This is the third head. The third head up at the top says, where were they going? Canaan. So come back to 3. These are the subdivisions. They were going to a place of peace, rest, plenty, happiness, cities, houses, wells, in word, everything. And then finally get to the end. Now,
It's almost like heads within heads.
yes. Yeah. Now, something to know too. Now the reason why I'm using Abraham Marshall is because he gives enough detail that you can see how it's working with a narrative. So here it is. If we strip away all those Roman numerals and everything else, this is what we have, right? They're leaving Egypt, their journey, where they were going. So these are a series of statements. This isn't a long, continuous thing. Hard to get to them to go, brought by the power of God. They left Egypt, traveled 3 days in the wilderness, crossed the sea. They sang God's praises, led by a cloud. So it's tracking this story. And the way it's tracking, it's not just giving a summary, a short summary that says, they departed and made their way through the wilderness until they came to Canaan. But they're actually hitting the main kind of events along the way. And these each individual phrase or word is ahead.
Right.
Now, when you look at this, you can see how it relates. Oh, I put a slide in here that I forgot. Now, when you look at this process of composition is actually explicitly mentioned in the text of the Book of Mormon. In Jacob, chapter 1, verses 2 and 4, he's talking about how Nephi was turning over the plates to him and giving him instructions on what to do. And he says, So Nephi gave me, Jacob, a commandment that I should write upon these plates a few things which I consider to be most precious. And if there were preaching, which was sacred, or revelation, which was great, or prophesying, that I should engraven the heads of them upon these plates and touch upon them or expand upon them, amplify them as much as were possible for Christ's sake and for the sake of our people. So this is an explicit description of laying down heads, where you have these succession of statements that are the main heads of a story or a sermon. And then once you have those main heads down, then when you redo the sermon or when you record the sermon, then you expand upon those heads. And when you're preaching, you expand upon those heads during the preaching. There would be people in the audience. Another way of definition of laying down heads is there would be people in the audience who are listening to a sermon. They're familiar with this pattern. So what they would do is either in their memory or on a piece of paper, they would just write down the main points as the preacher got to it. And then later they would go home and among their family, they would revisit these heads and kind of expand it out to say, oh, this is what the preacher is saying. That's what the preacher is saying. This slide is out of place, but this is an example of an explicit reference to this specific method
It's interesting that
in
it
the
says
Book of Mormon.
engraving the heads of them upon these plates. If I'm
Mhm.
putting on my apologetic hat, what if somebody were to say that, well, this is Joseph, him rendering the translation in his language, and maybe the ancient Nephites engraved sort of heads or like main points of some of their preaching or their sermons on, like, what if this was an ancient Nephite practice as well? I could see
Okay,
that as an apologetic.
so that's fine. I don't, great. But I will come back to something because when you have an outline of heads and when you talk about the things that are used as chapter headings or introduction to book headings, those come from a very specific time and place.
Aye.
And to say that, the Nephites just suddenly somehow came up with the exact same device from the very beginning, the moment that they left Jerusalem, because, we have it right at the first Nephi, there's some serious problems with those theories.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll save my other
So,
question for later because I think that'll tie in later. Okay.
okay. So anyway, this is what the next thing was supposed to be. So we saw the sermon notes of Abraham Marshall when he is talking about how Moses, we got a phone coming, when Moses was going to Canaan,
Hmm.
right? So now I went over and we're looking at the same thing in the biblical apparatus. Adam Clarke, whose name comes up a lot in Mormon studies, and Joseph Smith, because Joseph appears to have used Adam Clarke's commentary on the Bible. Adam Clarke also was a preacher. And so you can see a little bit of difference, but it's the same type of thing. Now, here, this is the same story, and this is how Adam Clarke does it in the biblical apparatus. And so I showed this down at the bottom because it might be kind of hard to read in the original. And then up in the original there, you can see little numbers following a phrase.
Yes, yeah.
That's just the verse number. So he's really helping people, not just giving them an outline of the chapter, but even giving them the verse number where they can go specifically to it. So it's a finding aid. But here's this, and you kind of think back to Abraham Marshall's sermon notes. We have something similar here. Because Adam Clarke, the sermon notes are for the preacher. So the preacher's only going to write enough information for him to remember what he needs to say. So he doesn't have to go in detail.
Yeah, it's like a prompt.
Yeah. So Adam Clarke, he realizes it's not for his benefit, it's for the reader's benefit. So he's going to give a little bit more information so that he can help all the readers find stuff. But that's really about the only difference. It's a series again of heads. Moses entreats Hobab the Midianite to accompany them through the wilderness. Boom. That's a head. It's a separate statement. He refuses. Boom. Separate statement. Moses continues and strengthens his entreaties with reasonings and promises. Boom. Separate statement. They depart from Sinai, 3 days' journey. Boom. Okay. So this isn't a continuously written summary in a single sentence or two sentences. These are specific bam, 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 bam points that are being made. And each of those are called heads. And so that's how the sermon notes and the biblical apparatus are kind of bleeding back and forth in sermon culture. Now, when you go to the opening of Nephi, this is the same apparatus. An account of Lehi and his wife Sarai, their 4 sons. The Lord warns Lehi to depart out of the land of Jerusalem, and they seek to destroy his life. He taketh 3 days' journey into the wilderness with his family. Nephi taketh his brethren, returns to the land of Jerusalem to the record of Jews, the account of their sufferings. They take the daughters of Ishmael to wife. So this is the same thing. Bam, bam, bam. You're going through, and while it's a summary of what follows, it's a very particular type of summary. Not all summaries are created equal. All right. There's a particular kind. Now, I don't even remember
the same pattern or the same
yeah,
structure,
it's
almost same formula.
Yeah, it's the same technical parameters. So when you're looking at formatting, you're looking at placement in the text. When you're looking at even the style of the phrases, some of them are short sentences, some are just a key word. Sometimes it's a noun phrase, not a full sentence, or a verbal phrase, or even just a prepositional phrase. All of these things are tied to a very specific textual tradition. So anyway, coming back to Joseph and these preparatory notes, when you look at this in the preliminary translation, Joseph was creating these preliminary outlines as part of the preliminary translation process. And we see evidence of that in the text itself. And oftentimes they're chapter headings. Those are the most obvious, blatant ones. But a lot of them are actually embedded within the story itself.
And just to clarify, because people may conflate the chapter headings, which are like italicized before each chapter, they were not on the original manuscript. They were put in later, but you're talking about the ones that are usually at the beginning of each book, or maybe like a new bit of narrative that are italicized like this. These ones were in the original manuscript that was dictated.
Yeah, so the ones that you see on the screen here, these were dictated in the original, and that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. These are ones that were part of the original dictation.
Aye.
Now, in a modern Book of Mormon, we have a whole bunch of these that were put in much later. And so
Which are
just
like
so
extra
people
heads.
extra heads. So and because in the Book of Mormon, they're sporadic. They appear here, they're not there. They're really detailed over here, and then they're painfully short over there. They're very inconsistent, and there are a lot of gaps in some of them. They don't actually track every single event that took place all the time, or
Right.
sometimes they're so general that it's almost a different type of summary. But these are ones that were in the original dictation.
Mm-hmm.
And so the argument is that these little sketch outlines that he used those to help refresh his memory of this preliminary translation with the gift of translation and seeking divine inspiration to discover the details, that this was part of that initial work to kind of lay the groundwork for when he actually started dictating the
Okay.
text.
So I have a question related to your theory. Probably later you'll talk exactly about your theory, how you think the mechanics were. But do you believe that Joseph? So you believe Joseph wrote out these notes? He mentally studied it out, formulated when he was happy with it. He could have had maybe some notes which he concealed. Do you believe that he looked at those notes at the beginning of the dictation session, or do you believe prior to it he maybe consulted them as a refresher, and then he just orally dictated the heads?
Okay, so what I think he did is in preparation for the dictation sessions. What I think he did is he just went off like what he always does is go off to a place where it's private, where he can clear his mind of whatever's going on and just focus on, pray and get the spirit, and then to look at whatever the outlines are for what he's going to dictate that day or what he's planning to, and to just kind of refresh his memory. But the idea is then that he closes that up and puts it away, because if you're too rigid about following an outline, then you shut off the opportunity for additional inspiration. And I think that the text of the Book of Mormon frequently shows these kind of strange tangents and departures, and then coming back to a story, and then a strange tangent and departure, and coming back to the story. So I think the text actually shows that Joseph Smith was not following a rigid outline in front of him during dictation, but that he wanted to have that out of the way so that he could just let the Spirit inspire him to go wherever the Spirit led him, even if it was new information that he hadn't thought of before.
Okay. So to clarify, just so I fully understand, you believe prior to the dictation session with one of the scribes, he might have consulted these notes or these heads. He
Yes.
would have had to have, for example, dictated the head for prior to First Nephi. Do you believe he would have recited that sort of from memory when he was had his face in the hat looking at
Yes.
the translation instrument? Okay, so that would have been the only thing that you would see as that was sort of a recitation from memory from notes, but then the
Yeah.
rest of the text is based on that outline, but he's free to sort of expand or deviate as he feels inspired.
Right.
Okay, that's fine.
And that's kind of what is here. So when the time came for dictation, he reviewed his story outlines in private to refresh his memory. He then set aside the notes and did not use them during the actual dictations. He trusted the Holy Ghost would guide him and fill his heart with the words. Now in the book, this is the version I favor. I did also mention that there is a possibility that he had committed these outlines to memory as well. And the reason why I did that is because I don't want to underestimate the cultural practices of early 19th century, because they relied heavily on memory in ways that we don't in our modern world. And so I didn't want to close off that possibility, even though I think it's unlikely. I think Joseph actually did have notes, but he kept them among his private papers. He would glance at them, put them away, and then after he did that, then he would, this is the next slide, then he would use the seer stone, because this gave him greater flexibility to focus on listening to the Spirit in the course of the translation, and that this would help open him up spiritually. It would give him something to concentrate on. And then he could make any improvised changes or additions, whatever. And that the argument is that by this method of translation, Joseph produced the Book of Mormon as an oral performance, meaning he didn't write the words in advance. The words came out improvised, but from a prepared outline. And he was simply using the same popular and common techniques that preachers, public speakers, and storytellers used in the 19th century. So that
Okay.
is the theory.
That's the theory. Um, and so you believe prior, so you believe it was semi extemporaneous, so it wasn't memorized, but you would believe that a lot of the plot lines, a lot of the main characters, even a lot of the sermons he might have had in mind, maybe free to adapt, but do you sort of think that he had the main sort of outline narrative beyond the heads already mapped out in his head?
Some of them.
Some of them.
Yeah. But for each of the main story episodes, yeah, some kind of idea, some type of outline, and just key to know that what he was going to be speaking about. When it comes to sermons, that's a different question. Um, and I think I have a section about that. But when it comes to sermons in the Book of Mormon, and I think when some people were talking about my book in your interviews before, they're saying, well, where are the sermon outlines? This theory doesn't account for the sermons. But
Right. That's
then,
gonna be one of my questions. Yeah.
so let me go out of this for a second because I did approach that.
I don't know if you have
Uh,
a slide on this, but I know you had two chapters in your book that you talked about Joseph employing this laying down heads technique in his 1832 history, as well as the King Follett discourse. I don't know if you have a slide on
yeah,
that, but I know
like,
that was in your book, using that as sort of like an example of Joseph utilizing this technique in two other sort of
yeah.
works, well, written in
Let
one oral.
Okay, let's go look at that real quick so
Oh,
that
I,
we
I
can
don't think
take
I
it.
saw all these slides.
Yeah, I've got gobs of them
Oh wow.
and way too many. So let's go to the 1832 history. And this is another thing that we would call, well, it's kind of in between internal and external evidence. It's not internal to the Book of Mormon, but it's not some external historical description by someone making an observation. But when we talk about this process of laying down heads, and then to make an outline of a story, and then following those heads to create the story. Joseph Smith does that with his 1832 history. And so we're going to take a look. This is the 1832 history. And these in the brackets, this 1, 2, 3, that's me. That's just so to break it up in this handwriting to see where the separate heads are.
How did he separate it with like a dash or like a bullet point in in his history, or was it just like a gap?
Well, in this first part, this wasn't Joseph Smith's handwriting for the majority of it. It was Frederick G. Williams.
Right, right.
And we need to talk about that as well too. Um, at the very end, so a history of the life of Joseph Smith. This first big, when you get down to the bottom, you see where it's kind of bolded. The keys of the kingdom of God conferred
Mm-hmm.
upon him. That's where Joseph Smith's handwriting begins.
Oh, okay.
And so what is happening here? What I'm saying or proposing is that Joseph Smith, most of the time, he didn't like to write himself. He would have his scribes, um, and he would dictate to his scribes, and they would write it down. So,
Right. So he'd be dictating in this instance.
yeah, so he's dictating this construction of this story. So, well, I got to tell my story, and this was abandoned, by the way, but he didn't finish it. So he dictates this to Frederick Williams, a history of the life of Joseph Smith Jr., an account of his marvelous experience, his first vision, and all of the mighty acts which he doeth in the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, of whom he beareth record, and also an account of the rise of the church on the eve of time, according as the Lord brought forth and established by his hand. Firstly, he receiving the testimony on high. Secondly, the ministering of angels. Thirdly, and it continues like this. And
Right.
then something happened in the course of Joseph dictating to Frederick Williams. Maybe Frederick suddenly had to, some kind of emergency he had to run off to, because Joseph Smith takes over. Joseph Smith doesn't, it's not like this was a false start. Joseph didn't cross it all out and start his own thing, but instead he continues what Frederick was scribing for him, he continues the heads and the keys, the kingdom of God conferred upon him and the continuation of the blessings of God to him. And then right after that, you see this really long line in Joseph Smith's handwriting. And this is a point where this alone tells us that Joseph Smith knows what he's doing, because he knows that all of this information previous is an outline, because that is a notation to let someone know who's going to print this later that this is the break between the original heads and then the start of the actual text of the history.
Oh, okay. That's what that line's there to indicate. This is the end of the
Yeah.
heads. Now we're starting to write the history. Okay.
And we've got Joseph Smith doing this. So we know that Joseph Smith knows the difference between this introductory head portion and this later portion. Now I'm going to bring something up real quick here. Some people have argued that maybe Frederick Williams was writing this all on his own, that he wasn't listening to Joseph Smith, but he was trying to write the history, and then Joseph came in and took over and did it. There are problems with that. And one of them is just what we spoke about. You know, this, if Joseph Smith was throwing out someone else's work and starting from scratch, he would not be continuing the heads and then drawing this line and continuing with the story and conforming to it.
Right.
It would be brand new. But then the other thing about that internally is when you go back up here, I'm not prepared to give the whole details of this, but when on the third head, and all the mighty acts which he doeth in the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, of whom he beareth record, that is a very complex phrase that's a formula, meaning you'll see this same type of phrase articulated as kind of the basis. Like, you know, if I were to say, to go to work or not to go to work, that's the question. You know, that's something people will laugh at. Why do they laugh at it? Because they realize, oh, that's what Hamlet said, right?
Right.
And you're swapping out some of the words to be or not to be. That's the question. To go to work or not to go to work. That's the question. And so that is what kind of a formula is. There's this type of phrase that could be repeated verbatim, or a phrase where you can swap out certain words, but it's still the same underlying phrase, same underlying syntax. So this up here on number 3, that's one of those formulas that gets reused. It also appears in the Doctrine and Covenants with some things swapped out. It also appears in the Book of Mormon with some things swapped out. Parts of it are based on a New Testament scripture, but it's been expanded. And those expansions, the more and more you expand that formula, the fewer and fewer people are using it. And so and I'm going into the weeds, I think. I apologize. But what I'm trying to get at is that this is a phrase that Joseph Smith has used before in the Doctrine and Covenants, in his history, in the Book of Mormon. And oddly enough, his father used it in one of the patriarchal blessings. So it's things like that that point to where that is very powerful evidence to say that Joseph Smith was the one dictating this to Frederick Williams, but it was not Frederick Williams' own original words, that he was acting as a scribe here. Now, something else to look at this. So the way this works, see this opening, a history of the life of Joseph Smith?
Mm-hmm.
So that's how you know this is a head as well. You go, the top one, the history of Joseph Smith, that's the head for a whole section of the story. So this is the first head, and when you go down to the story being told, here's the expansion of that head. I was born in the town of Sharon in the state of Vermont, North America, in the 23rd day of December, 1805, of goodly parents. All right, so that is how this works. And so this shows us that Joseph Smith in 1832 understood this technique. And when you
Right.
think back, if Joseph Smith is the translator of the Book of Mormon, when Jacob is saying we engrave in the heads and touch upon them, in order for a translator to use those words to describe what the ancient Nephites are doing, he has to know what they mean in his own contemporary time. So the Book
Or
of Mormon
convey it in a way
itself,
that the audience would understand, it would make sense to them.
right? So that provides additional evidence that not only is Joseph Smith doing this method, Joseph Smith, through the translation of trying to articulate what Nephite says, used the same language, meaning he was aware of this. He didn't just suddenly learn it in 1832 for the very first time and then try to use it. This is something that he had been familiar with during the time of the dictation of the Book of Mormon.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead with this question, but I would like to ask it kind of on this topic. To what extent, because we know Joseph was going to revivals and going to the different denominations. He said he was more, I can't remember the phrasing, but he lent more to the Methodists. He was more
Yeah,
partial to them. I think there's a couple of quotes of him participating like in a juvenile debate society, and
yeah,
somebody said that he was a pastoral exhorter. But to what extent was Joseph involved in like the sermon culture and aware of these techniques, if that makes sense? Like, was he just visiting, or to what extent would you say he was immersed in the oral sermon culture? I don't know if
yeah.
you have slides on this, but I think it might be relevant.
Yeah, I might have some slides, but maybe just to try to be brief about it. When Joseph Smith said that he wanted to learn about what was going on, so we started attending revivals. A lot of these revivals were joint revivals, so you'd have a Baptist and a Presbyterian and a Methodist all preaching at the same revival.
Right.
Um, but when it comes to laying down heads and following this sermon pattern that we talked about before, the doctrine and use, where they'd start out, here's the text, our scripture, and you know first point, second point, third point, all this. Joseph Smith would have been encountering this ever since he was a kid. He would have been hearing these any of the churches that they talk about they're going to. They are always attending, whether it's when Lucy and some of the kids joined the Presbyterians. Joseph Smith was attending a Sunday school, apparently with the Presbyterians, because some people thought that he joined the church because he was attending apparently at some point with his family. Um, Exhorting, the time he would have spent with the Methodists as an exhorter would have been less than 6 months, because when you were joining a class and that was kind of like, you're like an investigator for in the church, and there was kind of like this 6 month period where a person essentially usually would commit to becoming a Methodist or not.
Was that when he was
And
visiting Emma, or is this when he was younger?
no, this is when he was younger.
Okay.
So that was another time when he attended or tried to attend a Methodist class meeting, but then some of Emma's relatives were really upset by that. So you're just a necromancer, a glass lurker, get out of
Right.
here. And so
Right.
they kicked him out. But the exhorting, and it's not hard to learn how to do exhorting. I mean, because it's for an exhorter. Now you had to know laying down heads if you were going to be a passable exhorter. And the reason why is an exhorter was you would have the main preacher, and the preachers, when you became a licensed preacher among the Methodists, that means you were given they trusted you to interpret scriptures in a way that conformed to Methodist theology. And so they didn't want people coming into it who had only been there a month and then start preaching, because they might go off on some other theological non-Methodist. They wanted quality control.
Right. Right.
And a lot of the Methodist preachers were people who were not super well educated, who had very basic common school education and maybe nothing more. And so the Methodist culture also had this kind of reading program, the Christian library that Wesley had put together. They would all, kind of have a reading. It was multiple volumes. It'd take you forever to read through all of it. So people read it piecemeal, but that was a way of training them to understand the Methodist way. So an exhorter, something that Joseph Smith was doing, is they would be looking for people who are joining class meetings if they felt inspired to get up and exhort. Then you could, and the leaders are always kind of looking for someone who has a gift for preaching, and it was a natural gift, who just had a talent for it. And but there wasn't any sort of intense training program that you had to get involved with that some people have suggested. That's not how it worked. And because it was just you learned it by doing it. And someone could explain if someone had never come across this before, had never attended any church where all of these people are doing laying down heads and was totally, lived in a vacuum and a babe in the woods, even if they went to a class meeting, this is something that you could explain to them in a matter of minutes, where here's you just follow these certain main points, and the exhorters were given more latitude. They didn't have to have a prepared sermon because the preacher was doing that for them. So the preacher would get up, the preacher would have interpret a text, the preacher would have two or three main points about the text. Now the exhorter, the whole time the preacher is preaching, the exhorter is listening. And if the preacher hasn't already told him what the sermon's going to be about, the exhorter still didn't have to know in advance anything. They just had to listen and pay attention. So as soon as the preacher was done preaching, then the exhorter would get up. And the preacher said, we need to learn this. The preacher said, we need to learn that. The preacher said, we need to know this. And so they're following the main points. So to be a good exhorter, you would have to know this laying down heads process just so that you could reaffirm what the preacher said.
Yeah, kind of like re-emphasizing it.
Yeah. And so we may not have someone say, oh, Joseph Smith talked to a preacher, some historical, and the preacher sat him down and explained the heads. You're never going to find a historical reference like that. It's a red herring to say, oh, we don't have that reference, therefore you can't prove this. That's just a polemical response. It's not a good historical methodology response.
And you're saying that this was a very what's the words, collective, or like a lot of the people that give sermons, regardless of the denomination, this was the most common technique
Yes.
that was employed. Like this was almost like
Oh, yes.
almost
Yes.
like nationwide. Like this was sort of how it was done.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And the major difference was in delivery because, and let me take that back. Even people who were the more conservative Congregationalists, for example, where they might write out the entire sermon, they would still use that pattern. They would just read it. We're talking about the text today. Here's our introduction, and we're going to talk about A, B, C, D. Are you still awake? Okay, they're still awake. Okay, first point. They were still following the sermon pattern. And it's called a doctrine and use pattern. But the delivery was different.
I see.
Yeah, and these evangelical preachers, they just kind of went in with this little outline or none at all, and then they'd go off. And
not to sidetrack or go on a side tangent, but I believe in the Book of Mormon, I know that the word exhort appears a lot throughout the Book of Mormon, which again you could attribute to that being Joe Smith's vocabulary and him as the translator. I think Alma and Amulek is almost like an example of that, because Alma is sort of like the main preacher, and I think they went to Ammonihah together, and Amulek was sort of like this inactive member who was kind of like his missionary companion. I remember us talking about this story a lot as missionaries trying to unite with members. And Alma, I think, was an example of doing the main preaching. But then after, in the next chapter, Amulek, I think, is doing a lot of the exhorting, which you could, see the connections to, a preacher and then an exhorter in Joseph's time.
Yeah, that's exactly how it worked too. And these exhorters often were preachers in training, so they would move from not just supporting what the preacher was saying, but as they developed and as they matured, as they at least understood the doctrines, then they could start to participate as preaching too. But they always came in as that support, and there was that tag team. And it's not just similar because that's the way the two of them preached, but they also did what was similar to the circuit the circuit preachers. They had a circuit they went to, go to this town, preach, go to that town, preach, go to that. And that's what Alma and Amulek were also starting to do. There's some just interesting parallels to think about, but
So
yeah,
with
that's
Joseph Smith, there's no evidence prior to the Book of Mormon that he was a preacher, but there is that
no.
account of him being a passable exhorter, I think is the
Mhm.
wording that was given, and
Yeah.
participating in like a debate, juvenile society, where they're debating about, I'm sure, different Christian theological topics. Okay.
Religion and politics. I'm going to back out of this a little bit. Oh, anyway, so going back to this, I had these little things pointing out where Joseph Smith had started writing. This is where he had it. This is just an image from it. You see that long line at the bottom right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is that long line where he's Joseph Smith is letting us know in manuscript notation that there's this separation between the heads that come before and then the actual main text that comes after it.
Gotcha.
Um, and the other thing you look at is just the similarity. Um, an account of Lehi and his wife Sariah, and then the opening of it when he says, I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, therefore I was taught somewhat in the language. I'm going to move out of this for a second, and I'm going to go back because we're dealing with stuff that is formulaic. There are certain conventions. So let's go back to this one. I'm going to kind of forward through it a little bit. So when you look at this, the history of Joseph Smith Jr., and then you go down to the opening of the text. I was born in the town of Sharon of goodly parents. That's a really common way that people did autobiographical openings. They would talk about me, where I was born, and I was born of goodly parents. You have this thing here in Nephi, an account of Lehi and his wife Sarai and his four sons being called Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi. I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents. Therefore, I was taught. This is uh, a, another formula. Here is in the book I mentioned Robinson Crusoe. This is the opening heads for the first chapter, and he talks about my birth and parentage. And he begins it. I was born in the year 13 in the city of York of a good family, though not of that country, my father being born. So this was a really common convention for doing autobiographical type or style. So this is a novel; it's not real, but that's a common formula. And
So
so
it's similar
this,
not just in sermon culture, but also writing like an
oh yeah, oh yeah,
autobiography.
this is in all kinds of books. This is in
Autobiography. I said that
oh,
wrong.
it's just it's in scientific books, it's in novels, it's in this style of I mean this was just a really super common convention.
Mm,
And the other thing, the reason why I'm pointing out these other similarities in the content is just to let people know that this kind of hints further that the translation that's going on is being filtered through someone who is a modern 19th century translator, because it's not just translating words, it's also conceptual. This is why you think of it as a loose translation than tight, because what's emerging here is a common convention of autobiography that's a modern type of articulation of the introduction of someone's. And so these are just little hints, little clues that Joseph Smith is doing translation, not simply reading words off a stone.
okay. I don't know whether to ask this question now or if you want me to save it for later about the apologetic response to this being anachronistic or 19th century element. Do you want me to ask it now?
Sure.
So I've read different sort of faithful scholars or apologists have responded that you saying that these headings or these heads in the Book of Mormon, that this is clearly a 19th century technique, so it's anachronistic in the Book of Mormon. They pointed to ancient texts, Josephus and maybe others, where ancient authors maybe had some sort of a heading. So they're arguing that maybe it's not anachronistic in the Book of Mormon, and
Yeah.
maybe this reflects more of like how it looks in the 19th century as Joseph is translating, but maybe there was still some sort of heading on the plates prior to the book. What's your response to that?
Right. Let's go look at it because I did prepare a section on that.
I
And
apologize that I'm asking questions and having you jump around.
no, that's all right. That's all right. I'm afraid that there were some questions I haven't gotten to yet, and I don't remember what they were. So I hope
That's fine. I'm
viewers
sure
aren't
they'll come back here.
frustrated.
It's grand.
Heads in antiquity. We're going to go into this in detail because there some of the things that some of the apologists have written about heads in antiquity are frankly incorrect.
Oh,
And um, I think that if people are serious about getting accurate information, that this is something to pay close attention to. We'll
this is
talk about it.
this is fighting talk. No, I'm just kidding.
It is. It is. This is the one part where I'm going to get a little bit of fighting talk because not only have people misrepresented what I said in the book, they've also made claims about headings in antiquity that are really, really problematic. And that's just a nice way of saying that some people have said things that are just flat out false. And I think that we owe it to members of the church that when we're doing apologetics, to understand that faithful apologetics is accurate information.
Yeah.
It should not be, I'm going to come up with some theory out of the blue in an attempt to try to reconcile things my way. And then, because sometimes in apologetics, there absolutely are moments when people are trying so hard to make something fit that they distort the information. And I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's malicious, but it happens. And so this is where we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. All right.
So
Let's see
headings
it.
in antiquity.
I
All
sound like
right.
Dan McClellan the way I said
Oh
that.
yeah, Dan. All right, let's see it.
Let's see it.
And then Dan's going to make a TikTok showing me how I don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sure, because he's just so freaking smart. Anyway, so here's the question. A few apologists have criticized your work, saying that you are, quote, assuming ancient historians did not use summary headings in their historical compilations, and that you are, quote, claiming, quote, that the presence of headings in the Book of Mormon is anachronistic and similar such arguments. And so the question is, are these critiques accurate? No, they are not accurate. That is not what I claimed. So people have apparently thought they understood what I was saying, but they came away with a faulty understanding of what I was saying. Those arguments, they're straw man arguments. They're faulty inferences and assumptions based on what I actually said. So let's take a closer look.
Okay.
To do this, we have to have a quick look at the history of paratextual features, and we are blasting over a very complicated, complex history, volumes and volumes of information and details that would kill most people to try to read because we'd go numb and fall over dead because it was so unbelievably boring. But anyway, when you're talking about headings, you're talking about something in a category that's called the paratext.
Okay.
Paratext is actually a broad category. So ancient textual traditions had a variety of what we call paratextual features. What are paratexts? Paratexts are the textual trappings that are attached to or associated with a work. And it could be actually attached to a book, like a title page. A paratext is, did you make this out of papyrus or modern paper? That's part of the paratext. This interview that we're having right now about my book, that means this interview is a paratext to the book. So it's kind of this, but to just kind of rein that in a little bit, it's things like in a modern book, for example, where you have the title page, table of contents, chapter headings, page numbers, bibliographies, indices. All those things are paratext. They're attached to the work. They're not necessarily part of the main narrative of the work. And so we're talking about when we talk about these chapter headings, we're talking about these paratexts. Now, when we go into the history in antiquity and we look at the way that ancient people tried to present their stories or their texts or their lists or their catalogs, they also have paratexts, and some of them are various types of titles, various types of colophons. Some of them are short encapsulating summaries. Some of them are various types of headings. And what's important is not all of these are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
In the history of writing, when we look at our modern text, though what we have today, the title page, the bibliography, the notes, the footnotes, those are all things that over time appeared in one form or another and changed and evolved and came together and fell apart and moved. It's a very dynamic history. It didn't just emerge fully formed all at once. And it didn't emerge fully formed all in just one place. So some traditions have features that are so similar to other features that today we will use a single term to describe all of them, even though they're not identical to one another. And that's something important to know when we look at documents about the past and how people attached paratext to their work, to understand that even if someone describes something as a summary, that doesn't mean every other summary out there was the same kind of summary.
Right.
There are
Okay.
all kinds of different summaries. And that's where one of the problems has come up. And anyway, so down here on 3, and it's just recognized that over time, this all developed and in different ways. And eventually, so when a modern book, when we look at the title page and it's got a bibliography and an index and table of contents, that's a convergence of a whole bunch of different textual traditions that evolved at different times in different places. All right. So with that kind of understanding in the book, and I'm really clear about this,
So this
in
is
the book,
quoting from the book.
yeah, so I am talking about a very specific type of heading. It's a synoptical heading. It's a summary that has very specific characteristics. Okay, and I start on page 16. This isn't the only time I describe it. I'm constantly describing it in various ways throughout the book. But this is where I set it up. Now, here is on page 16, the quote. In terms of application, this is the laying down of heads. This approach was quite simple and involved 2 basic steps. And I'm trying to simplify it for both people who used it for speaking, like sermons, as well as people who used it for writing. So I'm just trying to get right down to the core definition of what it is we're talking about in the book. So the speaker or author created a skeletal outline of his or her intended composition using, and this is important, a sequence of key phrases. It could be a keyword. These are the heads that concisely summarized each of the main topics, issues, or divisions of an idea contained within the overall passage that followed. Okay, so it's not, when we talk about a summary, someone could say, I'm going to summarize Star Wars by saying it's a story about battles taking place in another galaxy. That's a summary. Or I could say Star Wars is a story of Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and how they overcame the evil empire in a series of movies of Star Wars, Return of the Jedi, and that's the story. And so that's a more detailed summary.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get to one of these summaries where you say Star Wars, scene 1, Luke on Tatooine. Luke, and he goes out and he sees the Jawas. Luke then gets in an argument with his dad. Luke decides to buy these 2 foreign droids. Luke discovers this image of Princess Leia. And so if you have a summary that's hitting down all of the main events,
That's a
the
different
key
type of
events,
summary.
Yeah, that you're talking about something altogether different. So those are like three types of summaries, and those are the types of summaries that you're going to find when you start looking around. Now, in this, I repeatedly refer to this in my book. This specific type of summary. I talk about its style, its formatting, how it's the printing conventions, its functions, its relationship to biblical summaries, how it operates as a performance guide, a textual guide, introductory composition. All of it is coming back to this one type of textual device. Now, to be clear, we're not talking about any kind of summaries or headings that existed in all their types and varieties. We're talking about this specific type of summary heading. This, the account of Lehi and Sariah, the only time actually in the entire book where I mentioned that this is anachronism is once, and it was in relation to this one, right after I was talking about how it's a relationship to biblical headings. And so all I said is that this is an anachronism. I didn't say any kind of headings anywhere out there on the planet are anachronistic. I said this, which I've been talking about the entire book. This is an anachronism. Let's look at why. I don't know why I have this here. This is going back to Abraham's
Yeah, I was like,
notes.
we already looked at this slide.
Yeah. But I'm showing how, this is also in the preaching notes. It's the same apparatus. Adam Clark's biblical summaries. This is the same apparatus. You've got these heads that track the main points. And then how back at Robinson Crusoe, my parentage of birth at 19 years, elope, a storm rise, ship founders. It's the same apparatus. You're just seeing it in sermon notes. You're seeing the same apparatus in biblical summaries. You're seeing the same apparatus in non-biblical texts. You're seeing the same apparatus when Joseph Smith dictated his 1832 history. So back to Nephi, this is what we're talking about. Now, things to know about this. Let's look at this closely because this is when we get into the nitty gritty. This is when this is going into the weeds about the parameters and characteristics. These are not all of them, but these are some of them that are important for people to know specifically what they are looking at. So these summaries consist of non-narrative sequences of heads, meaning that they're separate, they're standalone heads. And when I say non-narrative, it doesn't mean that they can track a narrative, but the heads themselves are not appearing in a continuous flow of prose.
Right. It's not like a paragraph summary. It's like a separate head, the modern equivalent of like a different bullet point for each different point or section of the narrative.
Exactly. Now
Okay.
that is a key characteristic. Another one. The next one, the heads consist of keywords and short phrases that track the content or main ideas or events in the text that follow. In other words, it's not a generic summary, but a detailed summary that tracks the text.
Yeah. Okay.
So that kind of summary expresses it's linear, so you're following a sequence. What some scholars term indexicality. In other words, it's functioning in the similar manner to a table of contents.
Oh, okay.
So, and using the word indexicality, there's debates about that simply because a modern index is nonlinear. So you go back to an index and you say, oh, I wonder I wonder how many times the seer stone is mentioned in this book. And so it will point you to all the different pages throughout the book.
Right. Yeah.
That's nonlinear. So you can go and reference a text out of order.
Right. Yeah.
But see, that's a modern understanding of what an index is, because when you go back into the ancient world, there are textual apparatus that they work like an index, but then they also work like a table of contents, and they're not quite the same. Pliny the Elder did that. He had these massive volumes about natural history, and the whole entire first volume of this massive thing was nothing but outlines and heads for reference points into the book, but it didn't operate like a modern index does, and because this was part of the evolution of this device coming into the future. So anyway,
Okay.
this is one of the characteristics. So you have this indexicality where this isn't just a summary, but it's a summary that provides something similar to a table of contents. It's a finding aid. And then finally, this is
Very
something,
specific type,
oh yeah, it's very
which
specific.
matches what people were using in sermon culture, also in writing in the
Yes,
19th century.
yes. And
Yeah.
then finally, the style, how they're written actually is another defining feature or parameter that you have to look at and take into consideration. Because when you go back to the different places where even if they use headings, they don't always express the heading in the same way. And so, for example, the style, what we're looking at and the tradition it comes from, they are predominantly simple present. So now if you go up here, they take the daughters of Ishmael to wife. It sounds like it's happening now, right? It's not they took the daughters to Ishmael to wife, past tense, or they will take the daughters of Ishmael to wife, a future tense, or any other. It's always it's not always this way. Some people decided to do their own thing, but as a convention, as the practice of this, you have this simple present. It consists of keywords, short phrases, but you also have noun phrases. Look up here, the course of their travels. You don't have a subject, right? And it's not a verbal phrase where it says like traveling in the wilderness. That would be, a verbal phrase. Sometimes they're prepositional phrases. Um, all of these together describe a certain, you're starting to really narrow down which textual tradition used this when you start getting really detailed on how you describe the way this type of summary originated and where it came from. So we're going to look at that just for a second.
Okay.
Why are we here at this slide? Okay, here we go. Things people need to know. This specific indexical summary did not originate in the Egyptian textual tradition. Now, Egyptians have titles. They have titles that have similar content. They might even have really long titles. But Egyptians, they didn't have indexes. They didn't have tables of contexts. And this particular type of summary it has the same history and development out of the same devices that would eventually develop into indexes and tables of contents. This absolutely is not Egyptian. This kind of heading did not appear in the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, or the Late Kingdom. All right. And if we're going to be responsible about our scholarship, that needs to be put to bed. Okay. And there's something else. A lot of times people have tried to say, well, maybe these are colophons. They are not colophons. The colophons are very specific. They can appear at the back of a text. They can appear at the front of the text. Sometimes they have the name of the author of the text. Sometimes they don't. But these are scribal notations by the scribes who then were copying the text and giving notes about the nature of the text, where they copied it from. And so I understand that people are trying to look into the past and trying to find some sort of way to connect the Book of Mormon to antiquity. But there's a point when you push it too far and it breaks. This is another thing. These are not colophons. They're just not. Next thing, these have a specific history. This type of indexical summary originated in the Greco-Roman period. It did not exist until several hundred years after Lehi left Jerusalem. Okay, and what does that mean? Now, before people get too defensive and angry and think, oh my gosh, he's trying to tear down the Book of Mormon, we'll talk about it because there's solutions to this. Okay, so what it means is this kind of indexical summary is absolutely an anachronism in the Book of Mormon. It absolutely is. and it's frustrating. If I seem to be a little more animated right now, it's frustrating when I see people trying to force the definitions and parameters of things that are well established that people can observe. But of course, you have to go back into these esoteric topics, and half the time to see all this stuff, you have to be able to read what some German scholar said and then what some French guy responded to him with, and then and then everybody at some point was talking in Latin. So to get into this, it's so
Very in the
messy.
weeds.
Yeah, and so, but this is what you come up with, and so right. So what I'm saying is, don't panic. Don't panic.
So just to be clear, that you're saying the heading or the summary that we see in the Book of Mormon, that it's pretty much identical to what we see in the 19th century, and the headings that certain apologists or scholars have pointed to in some ancient texts, or those from like ancient Egyptian texts, you're saying it's a different type of summary or heading. It's not the same, so it doesn't resolve this being an anachronism or a 19th century element. Okay.
That is absolutely correct.
Okay.
That is absolutely correct. I understand the effort, and again, some people are just going to be ready to start fighting about that. Some people are just going to be ready to start fighting about that. But as God is my witness, these are not Egyptian. They are not colophons. These are not Egyptian. They are not colophons. They come from a very specific textual tradition. Several years after developed, Lehi left Jerusalem, and instead of trying to force all of these things and getting into a pretzel trying to figure it out, there's a much easier solution for your belief paradigm where you don't have to turn everything into a pretzel to make it work. And that simply is, and this is one, it's not the only solution, but I think it's the most plausible, is that when translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph relied on his own language, knowledge, and experience to express the text of the Book of Mormon in English. The translation, therefore, involved reinterpreting the ancient Nephite textual apparatus, whatever it was, into a more modern apparatus that 19th century readers would recognize and understand. And this reinterpretation made use of Joseph's preliminary translation process, which involved the inspired construction of these very same story outlines. And Joseph simply used these in an effort to present something that was more like a biblical style apparatus for the Book of Mormon. Problem solved, right?
And this wouldn't be too out of harmony with, some people lean more with the expansionist theory of the Book of Mormon, which is very much it's loose translation, and that hopefully I'm representing Blake Ostler correctly, because I've read through his article and I've interviewed him. So he would see some things as tight translation, some things it's rendering the meaning that's on the plates, but then some things which it's Joseph expanding or revealing that probably weren't on the plate text. So you're saying that most likely this wouldn't have been on the plate text. This is likely Joseph
not
Smith.
in that form.
Not in that
not
form.
In that form.
Okay.
Yeah. And see, if someone believes in tight translation, you can even make it work that way too, because if it's tight translation, Joseph Smith didn't do it, but somebody translated it, right? So if it were God or angels or someone else, then that's the point where it could have been, well, we've got these modern people, and these modern people are familiar with this type of textual apparatus. So the tight translation we're feeding Joseph onto the seer stone is going to incorporate that modern element for 19th century readers. So Joseph Smith might never know that anything was different on the plates themselves. He's just following what's on the surface of the book. And so that's another way to explain that. I think that's not as effective a translation, but that's a possibility.
And obviously to critics, they would probably see this as, if Joseph is the author, that this would support that this is an anachronistic or a 19th century element that he's drawing from, that people are using in his time.
So if someone says, I don't believe the Book of Mormon is true, I think Joseph Smith made it up, is say, well, it's obvious because he's using a modern textual element in it. And so,
well, yeah. I think it's important for you to clear that up. extending grace to some of those people who responded, do you think it's possible that they saw it as you're referring to like a summary or a head or a sketch outline as sort of like the anachronism, and they just sort of were looking for any sort of heading they could find, maybe not
Well,
maybe
well,
not fully
that's
understand that you're meaning this specific type of
yeah,
heading.
I'm perfectly happy to, because I think that's actually what happened is people read it, they did not understand what I was talking about, and so they just scattered out and looked for anything. Well, Aristotle mentioned summaries. Well, he's not talking about these summaries.
Hmm.
Aristotle's talking about a totally different summary. It's called Proemion, and it has a totally different history. And then and besides that, Aristotle was after Lehi. So trying to say that, I mean, so the argument has been changed, so people who are undermining have changed. It's a straw man argument. Oh, he's saying, I say this type of summary did not exist. Oh, he's saying no summaries existed. And here's all these ancient examples of where summaries existed. So this must destroy his thesis. It doesn't. It just, and taking something from Josephus the first century after Christ to try to prove that, they had the same thing 600 years earlier, that's not a really good strategy. And especially when, in fact, with Josephus, we don't even know what original Josephus looked like. I
Right.
mean,
Okay.
one of the apologists was saying, look, this is what Josephus did in his text. And the reality is the earliest Josephus text we have is not even in the original Greek. It's the Vaticanus. It was made sometime in the late fifth, early sixth century. And then every other text that's used to kind of put together a Josephus text comes from like clear up in the ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. And so when you look at a modern Josephus today, what it is people have had to go back to several different copies of the Josephus text and kind of edit them together into what they think was the original text. And then also, the example that was given was like a 1602 printed work of Josephus. And the claim was made that the headings that you see in this printed work in the 17th century somehow reflects accurately the headings that were in the original Josephus text. Um, wow. That is such a huge, ginormous error. I mean, anyone who's working in this type of field would never, ever, ever make that mistake. That's the huge assumption blunder that you just would never appear in a peer-reviewed work in which this was the subject of that journal. I mean, it's bad, but I don't want to go in. I'm going to move away from that. I would like to give people the benefit of the doubt, and I think that a lot of people do understand that. There are one or two people who I have spoken to directly and told them, and they have still chosen not to correct misrepresentations of my work that they could.
Oh, okay.
And that's when I get really disappointed because I think, if someone is an apologist for the church and they knowingly allow misrepresentation out there, then what does that say? Is this what we were taught to do as Latter-day Saints? But I don't want to go on into that because that's kind of the yucky part of critics and apologists that I just don't want to be a part of that.
Right. No,
You,
you want it to be accurate. You want understanding. So I appreciate you answering that argument and clarifying that. And yeah, that could be one of the downsides of the critics and apologists thing. I think it's totally all right if people are mistaken, if people get things wrong, to correct people's arguments. I think that's part of the learning scholarship
oh yeah.
process in a way. But definitely I've seen like between critics and apologists, it can be a bit polemic and polarizing. Both
Mhm.
sides can be guilty
Both
of it.
sides,
And
absolutely. And that's just to go back to my own personal story. That's because when I started going into trying to figure things out myself, um, and I did avoid, I was saying I didn't know who Dan Vogel was and stuff, but at one point I was eventually starting to read everybody, and the same type of stuff is going on both sides. People
Sure.
who are
Yeah.
trying to attack the church. I'm thinking, you don't really understand this well enough to be making this argument, and sometimes I think they genuinely believe what they're doing. About the people who are just purely malicious and intentionally twisting things, there are fewer people I've seen like that. I just think people are arguing from their understanding of something, and sometimes that understanding is not complete.
Yeah. Sure.
But I was shocked to see that kind of coming from the side of the good guys. Wait, why are we doing this? We
Yeah. I
don't need
feel
to
like
do this.
believing apologists, we almost should be held to a higher standard in the church, claiming to,
Yeah,
be disciples of Jesus Christ. We should all be civil and respectful and engage in good faith with each other. But I think
yeah,
apologists as well, I think they're almost held to a higher standard in that regard, because they're representing the church.
yeah. I had a
Um,
couple more slides just to kind of prove my point. It
yeah,
was
yeah,
meant to be humorous. I don't know if people are realize this or not, but what I wanted to say is ignoring this is not a solution, is what I'm saying. This is not a good apologetic defense. Ignoring the significant differences in technical parameters of ancient and modern paratexts, that's not good. And then instead forcing those indexical summaries into categories where they do not belong. That is not a good apologetic defense. Now, if people want to do it, fine, go ahead with it. I'm not in the business of defending or attacking, people's beliefs. You just go, if that's what they want, if that's what people need, go do it. But that's why I got this little thing up here. Someone trying to misidentify and miscategorize something. And the other
right.
thing is really want to, even if people hate me and don't like me and don't want to listen to a single thing I say, listen to this. Faithful scholarship should be accurate scholarship. That is a requirement. If we distort information in an effort to impose our desires onto the past, then we run the risk of inhibiting faith rather than supporting it. If
Yeah.
if someone thinks they have this great idea, but it turns out to be false, but they push it and push it and push it and attack everybody else so that they can be the king of the mountain. And if it turns out to be a false idea and people are believing it, what happens to your faith? It's
Not
going
on
to
a good
crumble at
foundation.
some point.
Yeah, I think
Real
President
faith,
Nelson said in a recent conference that good revelation is based upon good information as
yeah.
well.
There's a friend of mine. He's actually a distant cousin. He's a Lutheran pastor, and he said that there's this common saying, and I won't get it right exactly. He said, but you cannot defend the truth with falsehood.
Hmm.
And I thought, ooh, how applicable is that sometimes?
Yeah,
Okay.
no,
So anyway,
it's important to be accurate. Because yeah, like you said, any inaccurate or misleading, I don't want to attribute motives to people, but
right.
inaccurate, let's just say, scholarship or research, um, that can harm faith more in the long run than presenting more accurate scholarship. I think that can do more damage if people come to find out later that, oh, that was not completely accurate.
Yeah. And it's tough. It's tough because if someone has come out with this publication of an idea and it gets undermined, people's egos are on the line. Nobody is like this objective automaton who has no feelings. Some people, if they feel like their idea has been undermined, they take it personally. And so all of it's really messy. And so all this stuff is going on in there. And so the best thing to do is just to kind of step back. And that's why I said early on, pray about it. Go to the information yourself, pray about it. And you seek out information from people, but then ultimately it comes down when it's a matter of faith, then ultimately when the day's done, you have to pray about it and figure out what works for your own spiritual journey. Anyway,
So
so
I have a bunch more questions that I would
yeah,
like to ask about your theory, and also like questions challenging. I think we've been going a probably fairly long enough time that maybe we should wrap up a part one. And I'd be happy if you're happy to come back and do a part 2 and talk a little bit more. I
Sure.
think this has been great. I've loved us talking more about your theory for the Book of Mormon dictation or translation, and learning more about this laying down heads technique as well, and answering some of these questions or responses from apologists. And I'm hoping the next part to maybe just ask you more rapid fire questions. If there's anything more in your presentation you want to go over as well that we've not talked about, I think that could be good as well. And I would just say to all my listeners as well, check out your book, Visions in a Seer Stone. Also, you've been on a couple other podcasts. You were interviewed by John Dehlin, I think a few years ago, on Mormon Stories. I remember listening to there. And I think Rick
Yeah.
Bennett on Gospel
Rick Bennett.
Tangents has interviewed. So
And
I'll put them as well for people to check those out. But hopefully we'll do a very thorough analysis and overview of your theory and work. But no, thanks so much for coming on and doing part 1 with me.
well, thank you. This was fun.
Awesome. All right, listeners, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. Come back for part 2, and we'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.